For more than 2 millennia, the Celts have held a distinctive and recognizable place in history. Yet the mystery of their true beginnings remains unsolved. Historians still debate when, where, or how this vast cultural network first appeared, and even today, no single feature, except perhaps language, defines what it truly means to be Celtic. They emerged in prehistory as a constellation of tribes sharing similar traditions, art, beliefs, and social structures across Europe. From the Atlantic shores of Ireland and Brittany to the distant regions of Spain, Austria, and Turkey, traces of Celtic culture have endured. Their artistic expression, characterized by flowing patterns and symbolic motifs, continues to inspire modern craftsmanship. Many of their ideas, such as the emphasis on fair combat, honor, and the ideals of chivalry celebrated in Arthurian legends, became deeply woven into Western civilization. In many ways, the Celts helped shape the moral and cultural foundations of Europe. The very name Celt is itself a puzzle. Most of the ancient peoples now grouped under this term never used it to describe themselves. Roman authors like Julius Caesar spoke of the Celtae, and in southwestern Spain, tribes known as Celtici appear to have given rise to the term. The Greeks used Keltoi, their version of the same word, and these early forms show that the name should be pronounced with a hard kio sound. Other classical names, Galli in Latin and Galatai in Greek, were used interchangeably for similar peoples. The Galatians of Asia Minor, known from the Christian New Testament, were among them. The modern term Gael, used for the northern Celtic peoples, is linguistically related to Galatai. However, the word Celtic itself only gained widespread scholarly use in the 16th and 17th centuries, thanks to the studies of linguists like George Buchanan and Edward Lewid. No ancient writer ever applied it to the tribes of Britain or Ireland. Despite the uncertainty surrounding names and classifications, language remains the clearest indicator of Celtic identity. The early Celtic tongue eventually divided into 2 main branches, Goidelic, or Q-Celtic, and Brythonic, or P-Celtic. The Goidelic group gave rise to Irish Gaelic, Scots Gaelic, and Manx. Although Manx nearly vanished in the 19th century, it has since been revived, while Gaelic continues to thrive in parts of Ireland and Scotland. In regions like Galway, Kerry, and Cork, Irish remains an active language of daily life, and both nations have used modern media, radio, television, and education to keep their ancestral speech alive. The Brythonic branch includes Welsh, Cornish, and Breton, which are marked by a sound shift from K to P. For example, the Goidelic word sen, head, became pen in Brythonic, as seen in place names like Penzance, Holyhead. Likewise, the prefix mac, meaning son of, became map or mab in Welsh. Among these languages, Welsh has the strongest presence today, supported by a rich literary heritage and a growing population of speakers. Breton, though in decline, continues to be defended by cultural movements, while Cornish, once considered extinct, has experienced a spirited revival since the early 20th century. The Celtic languages encountered by Julius Caesar in Gaul were of the Brythonic type, often referred to as Gallo-Brittonic. As Rome expanded, Latin exerted great influence, especially on Brythonic dialects. Many everyday words in modern Welsh and Cornish, such as eaglewys, church, or pont, bridge, derive directly from Latin. Even the English word car ultimately comes from the ancient Celtic curris, meaning a chariot. Still, linguistic evidence, though valuable, reveals only part of the story. Words like rix, king, or peku, flock, link Celtic, Latin, and Sanskrit to common Indo-European roots, but they tell us little about how those societies actually lived or ruled. Language shows connection, not necessarily culture. To understand the Celts more fully, scholars rely on a mix of linguistic, literary, and archaeological evidence. Classical writers, Herodotus, Aristotle, Posidonius, Caesar, Cicero, Diodorus Siculus, Strabo, and others, described Celtic peoples, often portraying them as wild or barbaric. Their reports must be read with caution. Caesar and Strabo, for example, both wrote of wicker figures used for human sacrifice, yet these descriptions may owe more to imagination or repetition than fact. Archaeology suggests that such accounts were exaggerated or symbolic. Ancient authors frequently borrowed from each other, embellishing stories to captivate readers, so separating myth from truth remains a challenge. Even so, their words, mixed with the material evidence left in the ground, offer a fragmented but fascinating window into one of Europe's most influential civilizations. The Celts, the people who once stepped out of the prehistoric shadows and helped shape the identity of the Western world. Among the many ancient writers who described the Celtic peoples, 3 stand out for the depth of their accounts: Polybius, Posidonius, and Diodorus Siculus. Polybius, a Greek historian and statesman born around 200 BC, offered one of the earliest detailed portrayals of the Celtic tribes of Gaul in his history of Rome's expansion. Writing around 150 BC, he chronicled the rise of Roman power from the Punic Wars to the conquest of Greece, a period that led to his own exile in Rome. Posidonius, a philosopher and teacher of Cicero, was born in Syria and lived during the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. His wide travels through the Western Mediterranean may have brought him into direct contact with Celtic communities in Gaul and Spain. Unfortunately, only fragments of his work survive, most of them preserved through quotations or paraphrases by later authors. Diodorus Siculus, a Sicilian historian writing between 60 and 30 BC, composed an ambitious world history that included vivid accounts of Britain and Gaul. Whether his knowledge was first-hand or drawn from others is uncertain, but his descriptions of Celtic appearance, customs, and daily life became some of the most frequently cited in later centuries. Some writers, like Julius Caesar and Tacitus, had closer contact with the Celts. Caesar, the last great leader of the Roman Republic, conquered Gaul and led expeditions into Britain. His famous commentaries on the Gallic War remain a key source on the Celts, though the work was intended as political propaganda to justify his wars. Despite its bias, it provides rich ethnographic detail about the Celtic tribes he fought. Tacitus, who lived in the 1st century AD, never visited Britain himself, but learned much from his father-in-law Agricola, who governed the island. His style, concise, poetic, and sometimes ambiguous, makes him one of Rome's most skilled historians, and his writings offer striking portrayals of the British Celts and their character. Archaeology has since transformed our understanding of the Celts, providing physical evidence far more reliable than ancient literary impressions. Artifacts, inscriptions, and settlement remains can be scientifically tested, though their interpretation is not always straightforward. An urn may tell us where it was found, but not how it was used or what beliefs surrounded it. Much of the archaeological record lacks written explanation, leaving scholars to speculate. While many finds are well understood, others, such as underground passageways and mysterious structures known as fogus, remain open to debate. Herodotus, often called the father of history, wrote centuries before these later authors and believed that the Celts originated near the Danube. He grouped them alongside Iberians and Scythians, suggesting that cultural exchange or even shared ancestry might have linked these peoples. His description of Scythian warriors who displayed the severed heads of their enemies as trophies bears a striking resemblance to later reports of Celtic headhunting rituals. Though some details may reflect exaggeration or confusion, they suggest a world of fierce warrior traditions and symbolic displays of power. Ancient sources often blurred the lines between Celts, Germans, and other northern peoples. Tribes like the Cimbri, Teutones, and Ambrones, long thought to be Germanic, share names and customs suggesting Celtic roots. The leader Boiorix, for instance, bears a clearly Celtic name meaning King of the Boy, a known Celtic tribe. Strabo claimed that Celts lived west of the Rhine, while Germans occupied the east, describing the latter as taller and blonder. Yet Strabo himself likely never left his library in Alexandria, and his confidence in first-hand observation was almost certainly misplaced. Distinctions in ancient texts between Celts, Germans, and Scythians are therefore unreliable and often reflect the prejudices or imagination of their authors. Some of the earliest Greek mentions of the Celts are fleeting. Xenophon referred to Celtic mercenaries serving in Greek wars, while Plato listed them among peoples prone to excessive drinking. To the Greeks, the world beyond their borders was divided into broad categories of barbarians: Scythians from the northeast, Iberians and Celts from the northwest, and the mysterious Hyperboreans from beyond the northern winds. In later centuries, storytellers like Diodorus Siculus sought mythical founders for the Celtic nations, just as Geoffrey of Monmouth would later do for the Britons. Diodorus traced their ancestry to Heracles, who, according to legend, fathered a son named Galates with a local princess in Gaul, supposedly the origin of the word Gallia. Though fanciful, such tales reflected Greek admiration for the Celts' warrior vitality, which reminded them of their own heroic age. Diodorus's vivid depictions of Celtic life are among the most colorful in ancient literature. He described communal feasts held around roaring fires, where warriors sat on animal skins and shared great cauldrons of roasted meat, the bravest among them receiving the best cuts. His physical description is equally striking. Tall, muscular men with fair skin and golden hair, which they lightened further with lime water to make it stiff and bright. They wore long mustaches that dipped into their food and drinks, brightly embroidered shirts, and striped cloaks fastened by brooches, garments that evoke early forms of tartan or plaid. Tacitus, writing later, tried to distinguish Celts from Germans, though his descriptions reveal how blurred these ethnic boundaries had become. He described the Germans as large, blue-eyed, red-haired, and powerful, but unable to endure heat or hardship, traits that could easily fit many Celtic warriors described by earlier authors. Herodotus, in turn, praised the Scythians for their adaptability and mobility, noting how they lived in wagons, raised livestock, and fought from horseback. While the Celts were farmers rather than nomads, some of their early tribes shared the same wandering lifestyle within defined territories. Even Tacitus, the most careful of Roman historians, admitted uncertainty about who the first peoples of Britain truly were. He observed differences among them. The red-haired Caledonians, who seemed northern in origin, the dark-haired Siluras of Wales, who might have come from Iberia, and others resembling the Gauls across the Channel. His insight, that appearance alone could not define ethnicity, was remarkably modern. Diodorus offered another distinction, noting that Celtic speech was deep, loud, and filled with riddles and boasting. They delighted in hyperbole, speaking in grand phrases that glorified themselves and diminished others, yet beneath their swagger lay quick intelligence and wit. Through such glimpses, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes accurate, the ancient world recorded the image of a people both formidable and fascinating, the Celts, whose legacy continues to stir imagination even today. Ancient writers often filtered the Celts through their own ideals. Diodorus, fascinated by likenesses to Homeric heroes, even cast Celtic women in that heroic mold and ventured into sensational claims about same-sex desire among men. Strabo echoed remarks about youthful relationships in Gaul. Yet both authors wrote from within a Greek world that celebrated the male form and celebrated bonds like those praised in epic tales, which likely colored their portrayals. Roman moralists seized on stories such as Queen Cartimandua's scandalous love life to warn their own matrons about supposed barbarian excess, turning Celtic sexuality into a cautionary fable rather than a measured description. Later, Ammianus Marcellinus revived the image of the towering, bold Achaean-style warrior to describe Gauls. Tall, fair, quick to quarrel, and terrifying in their gaze. He delighted in dramatic scenes in which formidable wives waded into fights with flashing eyes and flailing arms, overwhelming groups of outsiders. He noted voices that sounded fierce, whether in anger or at ease, yet also praised the remarkable neatness he observed, claiming even the poor kept themselves clean and decently dressed. In his view, they were hardy at any age, trained by cold and labor, fearless in danger, fond of strong drink, and susceptible to drifting into stupor on potent brews. Celtic drink certainly included mead made from honey and strong barley beers, the ancestors of later barley wines. Grooming, though, mattered as much as drinking. Hair was a primary badge of beauty. Men and women wore it long, often washed with lime, dyed, braided, and stiffened with animal fats to create dramatic shapes and gleaming colors. Irish heroic tales revel in golden tresses and extravagant manes, while Roman sources paint queens like Boudica with cascades of fiery hair. If coiffure was a crown, it helps explain why helmets appear comparatively rare in the archaeological record. A grand head of hair could be armor of identity. Cosmetics and careful washing added to the effect. Rather than oiling the body like Romans, the Celts favored soap and water, and likely scented their soaps with herbs. Men shaved the chin and throat, kept side whiskers, and wore sweeping mustaches. Mirrors and razors turn up often in graves, underscoring a culture attentive to appearance. Writers also comment that young men were fined if waist girth exceeded a set measure, linking slimness with virtue. In native traditions, physical flawlessness intertwined with authority. A king or queen had to embody beauty as well as power, an ideal that bound politics to the body. Dress reinforced rank and taste. Alongside breeches, the signature garment was the wool cloak, typically striped or checked, clasped at the shoulder with an ornate brooch. Fine summer weaves contrasted with heavy winter cloth, and the richness of the clasp signaled status. Underneath, linen tunics were belted and sometimes richly decorated. Women wore longer garments made from joined rectangles of cloth, the kind of draped dress seen across Europe, and patterned wrap skirts appear in northern finds. Footwear ranged from leather sandals and shoes to sturdy clogs, with water-resistant woods likely pressed into service where needed. Jewelry proclaimed identity as loudly as clothing. Ancient observers loved to describe gold ornaments glinting on necks and wrists. Most iconic of all was the torque, a rigid neck ring of twisted precious metal left open at the throat. Torques ride the necks of heroes and gods in art, hinting at sacred meaning as well as rank. Some were ritually broken and buried with coin hoards, Others bear inscriptions recording gifts to deities from named tribes. Rome eventually adopted the torque as a military honor, and cheaper versions in base metals spread widely. Set against these portraits is the long arc of Celtic history. The earliest clearly Celtic phase, around the 7th century BC, is named for Hallstatt in the Austrian Lake Country, where salt mines and vast cemeteries revealed a society moving from bronze to iron. Rich burials, imported goods, and cultivated crops sketch an aristocratic world linked by trade with Mediterranean ports such as Massalia. Around the 5th century BC, a new style crystallized at La Tène near Lake Neuchâtel. Sinuous art, two-horse chariots, and intensified contacts with Etruria and the wider Mediterranean. At this very moment, Greek letters were spreading, iron was transforming old kingdoms, and new philosophies were stirring. The Celts reached the British Isles well after Britain's great stone circles were built, so the henges and barrows belong to cultures older than theirs. The first famous clash in Roman memory came with the sack linked to Clusium in the 4th century BC, later retold by Livy. In the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, Celtic mercenaries appear in Mediterranean wars, and La Tène culture took hold in Britain and Ireland. Eastward, Celtic groups pushed into the Balkans, Greece, and central Anatolia, where Greek writers called them Galatai, and later generations remembered the raid on Delphi. Over the following centuries, Rome absorbed these peoples, completing the conquest of Gaul in the 1st century BC. Caesar's expeditions to Britain in the mid-1st century BC began a new phase. Permanent conquest followed under Claudius in the 1st century AD, and for 4 centuries much of the Celtic world, except Ireland, lived under Roman rule, with deep cultural blending, especially in religion and language. When Roman administration withdrew from Britain in the 5th century, the island society bore as much Roman imprint as native tradition. Germanic migrations by Angles, Saxons, and Jutes pressed Celtic communities west and north, narrowing their political space while preserving distinctive languages and customs on the Atlantic fringe. Some Britons crossed the Channel to Armorica, later Brittany, planting another Celtic homeland. In the centuries that followed, the linguistic paths of Goidelic and Brythonic continued to diverge, fixing the map of Celtic speech that still echoes today. As the Germanic peoples advanced across Britain, a powerful Celtic resistance arose, led by a warrior remembered in legend as Arthur. Whether known as Arturus or Ardu, this leader became the foundation for the enduring tale of King Arthur. During this time, the Celtic Church preserved Christianity in Britain and Ireland, standing firm against pagan invaders who worshipped gods like Thor and Odin. Ireland, meanwhile, entered a remarkable golden age between the 6th and 8th centuries, producing great saints and scholars until northern raiders, later known as Vikings, struck its shores. Some Irish settlers, called Scotti, crossed to the western lands of Caledonia, establishing a new kingdom that gave birth to the name Scotland. Old humor captured this intertwined identity. The Scots founded Ireland, and the Irish founded Scotland. Between the 12th and 14th centuries, Celtic voices began to appear in writing for the first time. These early texts, dense, poetic, and full of coded imagery, were crafted by monks who committed to parchment the oral traditions that had endured for centuries. They often mixed Christian ideas with fragments of older pagan myths, producing stories rich in symbolism and mystery. Despite their complexities, masterpieces like the Irish Táin Bó Cúailnge and the Welsh Mabinogion preserve the emotional depth and imagination of a people whose oral culture was among the richest in medieval Europe. By the late Middle Ages, Celtic independence across the Western world was steadily eroded. Wales lost its autonomy in the 13th century, while Cornwall slowly yielded to English power. The Cornish Rebellion of 1497, led by Miguel Joseph Angove and Thomas Flamanck, marked the last time a foreign force marched on London. Brittany was absorbed into France in the 16th century, and Ireland came under English rule soon after, its conquest completed under Elizabeth. The eventual union of Scotland and England in 1707 followed centuries of turmoil, and the failed uprisings of 1715 and 1745 crushed the old Highland clan system. Ireland's incorporation into the United Kingdom in 1801 lasted until the Easter Rising of 1916, which began the struggle for Irish independence, leading to partial statehood in 1921. From the earliest archaeological traces around 1200 BC to the later medieval manuscripts of the 14th century, the Celts emerge as a remarkably consistent society. Power rested with an aristocratic warrior class led by kings or queens, rulers often seen as semi-divine beings whose authority carried sacred weight. In the Hallstatt period, dating from the early Iron Age, we find grand tombs filled with treasures, swords, ornaments, and four-wheeled wagons, indicating both hierarchy and wealth. By 800 BC, Celtic trade networks were thriving, dealing in salt, iron, and luxury goods. Rich burials clustered around fortified hilltops, the first signs of organized royal centers. From 600 to 475 BC, the culture spread westward into what is now France and Germany, showing growing contact with Greek traders from Massalia. Artisans from the Mediterranean may have influenced Celtic craftsmanship, as evidenced by Greek-style ornaments found in elite tombs. The burial of a noblewoman at Mont-la-Soie in France revealed gold jewelry, Etruscan vessels, and a massive bronze cauldron adorned with mythic creatures, proof of an aristocracy linked by trade and culture to the classical world. Wealth from wine imports, exchanged for northern goods such as amber, tin, salt, and honey, sustained these kingdoms. A spectacular discovery at Hochdorf in Germany, dating to around 530 BC, offered a glimpse of this splendor. The chieftain, towering over 6 feet tall, lay adorned in gold, with weapons, jewelry, and hunting tools placed for use in the afterlife. A bronze couch and a four-wheeled chariot completed the scene, while drinking horns hung on the walls, a vivid picture of the Celtic ideal of the warrior lord. After 500 BC, a new cultural phase known as La Tène began to replace Hallstatt traditions. This period saw migrations northward and across the Alps into Italy, forming the Celtic world that later clashed with Rome. Livy's famous story of King Ambigatus sending his nephews to settle new lands tells of the Gauls' movement into Italy and beyond. Though steeped in legend, such tales reflect genuine expansion, driven by overpopulation and ambition. The archaeological record confirms that during this transition, Celtic art reached new heights of creativity. The rigid geometric designs of earlier centuries gave way to flowing, organic patterns, leaves merging into faces, animals transforming into spirals and knots. The intricate craftsmanship of La Tène art, with its inlays of coral and glass, revealed a culture of immense refinement, far removed from the stereotype of wild barbarians. Unlike Greeks and Romans who decorated temples and cities, the Celts adorned themselves. Their artistry appeared on swords, mirrors, helmets, and brooches. personal treasures that carried status and spiritual meaning. Yet when Roman influence spread through Gaul, this brilliance dimmed. Within a generation, Celtic art succumbed to imitation of classical styles. What had been a living, fluid art form became frozen by conquest. In Britain, however, Celtic traditions endured longer. By 250 BC, Latin influence had reached the islands, where local kings and warriors upheld the old order even as their continental kin fell under Roman rule. Ireland, untouched by the empire, preserved these customs well into the medieval age. At the heart of each tribe stood a ruler, a man or woman chosen not merely by bloodline, but by merit and divine favor. Legends of miraculous births, noble fosterage, and unblemished beauty echo this belief that kingship was sacred. The Celtic monarch was more than a political figure. He or she embodied the harmony of nature, courage, and right order, the living symbol of the tribe's soul. The foundation of Celtic society rested on deep personal loyalty to one's tribe, ruler, kin, and gods. These bonds formed the invisible glue that held their world together. While the Celts had an intricate set of laws, some predating even Greek and Roman codes, their political life revolved around two powerful forces: shared religious beliefs and the network of tribal allegiances that defined one's place in the world. Society was divided into three principal groups: the aristocracy, headed by kings or queens, the priestly class, led by druids, and the rest of the population. Courage and success in battle could elevate a warrior to noble status, even to rulership. But what made Celtic civilization unique among ancient cultures was the equal prestige given to the priesthood. The druids held the rank of nobility and were often as influential as monarchs themselves, presiding over legal judgments and spiritual matters alike. Accompanied by ovats, prophets and diviners, and bards who served as poets, historians, and satirists, they were central figures in both religion and governance. Some even commanded their own small bands of warriors, and kings were obliged to maintain and protect them. Within the broader society, artisans such as metalsmiths, chariot makers, and jewelers occupied a higher position among commoners, but the true mark of standing came from tribal membership. Belonging to a recognized clan granted protection and identity, no matter how humble one's means. This strong sense of kinship endured longest in the Celtic fringes of Britain and Ireland, and its echoes survive in the later clan loyalties of the Scottish Highlands, where devotion to one's lineage remained a defining trait. Another remarkable aspect of Celtic life was the respect accorded to women. In contrast to most ancient societies, Celtic women could possess land, lead armies, and even rule kingdoms. Numerous tribes were governed by queens, and women frequently fought beside men in battle. Marriage customs reflected this equality. Wealth brought into a union by the wife was matched by an equal contribution from the husband, and if one partner died, the survivor inherited the combined property. This balance of rights was tempered, however, by harsher realities. Roman observers noted that suspicion of wrongdoing could lead to severe punishment, showing that even within this progressive framework, contradictions existed. Yet in art, men and women were depicted side by side, equal in scale and dignity, symbolizing harmony rather than dominance. Marriage itself took many forms. Some unions were formal, sealed between noble families, while others were more flexible. Temporary vows exchanged at fairs that could be renewed or ended a year later. Such customs reveal a society that valued both freedom and practicality. Fosterage was another vital thread in the Celtic fabric. children of nobles were raised by other families, learning combat, governance, and social duty. This system built powerful networks of loyalty that transcended bloodlines. A foster child became as bound by honor to his adoptive family as to his own, creating lifelong alliances that strengthened tribal unity. The practice also instilled a code of truth and integrity. One's word was sacred, and a promise carried the weight of law. It was through such ideals that the Celts developed a sense of honor that would later evolve into the medieval chivalric code, influencing Western ethics for centuries. Daily survival demanded cooperation and discipline, especially during the harsh winters. Tribes stored grain and salted meat, while rival groups launched daring raids to secure cattle, the chief measure of wealth. One of these raids, remembered in Irish legend as the Cattle Raid of Cooley, immortalized the tensions and heroism of this way of life. Despite frequent warfare, bonds of fosterage and kinship often prevented destruction between neighboring tribes, preserving a balance between rivalry and respect. Religion formed another unifying force. The druids were more than priests. They were judges, philosophers, and healers who stood above tribal politics. Their wisdom commanded hospitality wherever they went, and their rulings carried the authority of divine law. A carefully spoken judgment was binding, and the power of words was believed to shape reality itself. Bards could bless or curse with equal force. A scathing satire, it was said, could wound the body or even cause death. Roman and Greek authors often portrayed the Celts as unruly barbarians, chaotic and undisciplined compared with Rome's order. Livy described them as brave but reckless, warriors who charged with thunderous fury but lacked endurance. Yet archaeological evidence and native law codes tell a different story. Celtic society was structured, hierarchical, and governed by clear customs. The ruler stood at the top, supported by noble families, druids, and free landowners. In Gaul, priests typically came from noble lineages, and similar systems existed in Britain and Ireland. Below them were the artisans and craftsmen whose skills sustained the tribe: metalworkers, potters, carpenters, hunters, and entertainers. At the lowest tier were slaves, a reality many later romanticists preferred to ignore, but which ancient sources confirm. Chains and manacles found at Latane and in British lakes testify to their presence, and classical authors remarked that slaves could be exchanged for a single jar of wine. Despite its divisions, Celtic society was not stagnant. It allowed movement through bravery, talent, or patronage. The practice of clientship, where one freeman pledged loyalty to another in exchange for protection, land, or credit, created a web of mutual obligation that bound people together across classes. Through such ties of fosterage, faith, and honor, the Celts built a civilization that prized courage, eloquence, and truth above all else, an enduring legacy that outlasted their kingdoms and still lingers in the moral imagination of the West. Celtic life was saturated with law. Beyond rules for fosterage, patronage, rank, marriage, and inheritance, an extensive body of customary practice governed daily conduct. Though this tradition was primarily oral and only partially preserved, what survives reveals a people who treated legality as a moral science. Two ideas sit at its core. First is the belief in a natural order. Law should mirror what is fitting, harmonious, and connected in the world. Second is the ethic of fair play. Strength should meet strength. Champions should face champions. Penalties must match offenses, and compensation should be proportionate to harm. Later compilers set parts of this tradition into writing. Irish origin legends that frame civic rules within myth and history, the dense Bran judgments that codified civil precedent, and Welsh triads that mix proverbial wisdom with practical norms. Ceremonies for installing kings and queens were likewise regulated with striking precision. Feasts and battles were twin stages on which honor lived or died. Boasting could ignite feuds, and the old tales relish scenes where words give way to steel. Heroes contest the choicest cut of meat, and insults are answered with grim trophies. Classical writers describe Celtic warfare in close detail: big shields and long, slashing swords made for thunderous charges, but left warriors clumsy in tight, thrusting combat against disciplined troops trained to stab and shield bash. Hillforts crowned ridges across the landscape, ramparts, ditches, and timbered gates guarding storehouses and households that could withdraw to safety when raiders came. In Ireland and the north, stone towers rose in circular compounds. In Britain, massive strongholds looked out over plains that later legend would fold into the Arthurian world. Arms and tactics reflected both spectacle and practicality. Spears came in throwing and thrusting forms. Some traditions speak of barbed or spiraled heads that tore on withdrawal. Helmets existed, but elaborate coiffures often did the cultural work of a crest, and ornate helms may have been as ceremonial as protective. Battles thundered with sound: harsh war horns, shrill cries, drum beats, the jeers of champions, meant to shake enemy nerve before blades met. Most distinct of all was the light, fast chariot, a wicker car behind nimble ponies, driven by one kinsman, while another hurled spears, leaping down to strike and springing back aboard as the team wheeled away. On the continent, cavalry later eclipsed chariots. Early saddles steadied riders long before stirrups reached the west. Celtic fighters also sold their skill abroad. Mercenary war bands appear from Italy to the eastern Mediterranean, sometimes fighting near naked to flaunt disdain for death. At sea, Atlantic tribes fielded stout, high-sided ships with leather sails that shrugged off storms and frustrated Roman boarding tactics. Yet the same fierce individualism that terrified opponents could fray unity. Rival clans jostled for precedence unless a rare leader forged a common cause. The taking of heads, so often noted by ancient observers, was more than crude tally-keeping. Skulls set in wall niches, preserved in oils, or displayed as sacred prizes suggest a belief that a person's essence dwelt in the head. Saga and legend transform this into theology, a severed, still-speaking head that blesses and protects a people, a raven-linked guardian whose buried presence wards a city. In this world, religion, rulership, and warfare were not separate spheres, but braided strands. Judgments could be spoken into binding force by priests and poets. Honor lived in oath and recompense, and victory or defeat rippled through the moral fabric of the tribe. Most of what we know about Celtic gods comes from inscriptions carved in Latin or, more rarely, Greek, during the centuries after Rome absorbed the Celtic world. Before then, Celtic religion was entirely oral, leaving no written prayers or scriptures. Only when the Romans began to identify local gods with their own deities did names and dedications appear in stone. The Roman historian Tacitus called this process interpretatio Romana, the Roman translation of foreign gods into familiar forms, an approach that allowed native traditions to survive under the shelter of imperial tolerance. Among these adapted figures, the Celtic god Bel or Belenus was linked with Apollo, the youthful bringer of light. His name survives in Beltane, the great fire festival of early May, which celebrated renewal, and the power of the sun. Shrines dedicated to him often contained small clay horses, symbols of vitality and speed. Other gods with similar solar or healing qualities included Cunomaglus, the Hound Lord, perhaps a hunter deity, and Granus, worshipped beside springs as a source of health and light. Granus frequently appeared together with the goddess Sirona, guardian of healing waters. Temples to these paired deities have been found from France to Germany, and even Britain, often containing offerings linked to bathing, medicine, and dreams of recovery. The Romans called such divine healers Apollo gods, though their Celtic roots ran far deeper. The thunderous power of the sky was personified through Jupiter-like figures, worshipped across Celtic lands under many names. Local variants, such as Taranis or Tanarus, embodied the storm god with his rumbling voice and blazing lightning. The Welsh and Cornish words for thunder still echo that name. Shrines to such sky fathers dotted the Pyrenees, the Alps, and the northern plains, linking mountain peaks with divine energy. Another recurring name, Mogans, meaning the Great One, appears along Hadrian's Wall in Britain and across the Rhine frontier, hinting at a god revered by soldiers and settlers alike. Altars dedicated to Viteris, or Veteres, further north, may represent a related spirit of strength and endurance, praised by both men and women for protection. Mars, the Roman god of war, found countless Celtic counterparts, each reflecting regional traditions of bravery and guardianship. Some, like Mars Belatucadrus and Mars Barex, were simple hill gods venerated by common soldiers. Others, such as Mars Camulos, once the protector of the town, later called Colchester, held tribal significance and may even echo in the legendary name Camelot. Celtic war deities were not merely destroyers. They could also heal. Mars Linus, honored by the Trevery tribe near modern Trier, combined martial vigor with the curative power of sacred waters. Mars Lucicius, the Shining One, shared this dual nature and was worshipped beside his consort, Nemetona, the goddess of sanctuaries and groves. Celtic religion was equally rich in household and agricultural gods. Sucellus, the bearded god with his long-handled hammer, symbolized strength joined with stability. His companion Nantosuelta, of the Winding Valley, carried a miniature house representing domestic peace and fertility. Together they embodied the union of work and nurture that sustained everyday life. Across Gaul and Britain, other divine figures merged with Hercules, the mighty Greek hero, forming local versions like Hercules Magusanus or Segomo, the victorious one. Mulot, whose name means mule, presided over shrines in western France, while Mars Nabelcus and Mars Oluodius blended the powers of warrior and provider, carrying symbols of abundance instead of weapons. Women, too, held divine authority on the battlefield. The Celts honored formidable goddesses of war and victory, among them Andraste, Andarta, and Brigantia. These were not passive consorts, but fierce leaders of armies, akin to Athena or Nike in the classical world. Ancient writers record that the Iceni queen Boudica called upon Andraste before leading her revolt against Rome, offering sacrifices in sacred groves. Brigantia, worshipped in northern Britain, wore wings and a crown, holding spear and shield, the very image of divine sovereignty. The goddess Boudica, bringer of victory, whose name survives in that of Boudica herself, was honored far beyond Britain, her cult spreading even to Gaul. Mercury, messenger and guide of travelers, found numerous Celtic reflections. Under names like Artaios, the bear god, perhaps ancestral to the legendary Arthur, he merged wisdom, craft, and strength. Tribes across France and Germany invoked him under different titles: Mercurius Arvernus, protector of the Central Highlands; Mercurius Siconius, guardian of roads and trade; and Mercurius Maccus, the boar god, whose name signified courage and power. Such diversity reveals the adaptability of the Celtic pantheon. Each valley, river, and tribe had its own divine patrons, yet all shared a reverence for vitality, nature, and the mysterious harmony between the seen and unseen worlds. Through these surviving names and images, carved in stone but born of song and memory, we glimpsed a religion that blended earth and sky, life and death, ferocity and beauty. The Roman Empire may have renamed the Celtic gods, but it could not erase them. Their echoes still linger in festivals, landscapes, and legends that continue to shape Europe's cultural soul. Although most of the surviving names of Celtic deities come from Latin inscriptions carved during Roman rule, many of these gods and goddesses belong entirely to the older, native Celtic world and have no real equivalents in classical mythology. Among the most distinctive of these are the mother goddesses, figures of fertility, abundance, and protection, often depicted in triplicate. Statues and carvings found across Europe show these divine mothers holding baskets of fruit or cradling infants, emblems of nourishment and renewal. Inscriptions to Alowina and Aveta in Germany portray them as givers of life and guardians of families. Other mother figures, such as Kaiva and Kuda, were honored with temples, altars, and votive gifts, sometimes accompanied by mysterious hooded companions called Geni Cuculati, spirits of fertility and protection, symbolizing the unseen powers that worked alongside the maternal divine. The triple goddess stood at the very heart of this sacred tradition, representing youth, maturity, and age, the maiden, the mother, and the crone. She was venerated throughout Celtic lands under countless names, often recorded as matres or matronae. These triads of deities were connected with healing springs, harvests, and domestic harmony. In Roman times, her cult spread widely. Hundreds of altars dedicated to the Matronae Vacalinae have been found in Germany, erected by legionaries who carried Celtic faith deep into the empire. Other local forms, such as the Matres Domesticae in Britain or the Matres Nemausicae in Gaul, show how she evolved from a tribal mother into a universal symbol of fertility and protection. Her presence even reached the famous healing temple at Bath, where she shared sacred space with Sulis Minerva. Celtic religion also celebrated divine pairs, male and female deities united in balance and creation. Ancamna stood beside Mars Lenus, the healing god of the Trevery. Bergusia and Ucuetus protected craftsmen and smiths in Alesia, and Rosmerta, the great provider, was often shown with Mercury, the god of trade and abundance. She was depicted offering coins or stirring a cauldron of plenty, a serpent resting at her side as a symbol of life's endless renewal. The wild world, too, had its gods. Forests, hills, and groves were sacred domains inhabited by spirits like Abnoba of the Black Forest and Nemetona, whose name evokes the holiness of the wooded sanctuary. Male counterparts such as Calirius, king of the Hazelwood, or Silvanus Cocidius, were worshipped as hunters and guardians of animals. Images found near Hadrian's Wall show them with stags and dogs, bow in hand, presiding over the forest's mysteries. The beach god Phagus, honored in the Pyrenees, and Contrabis, the one among the people, remind us that even trees carried divine presence in Celtic belief. Every species had its virtue. The oak stood for strength, the hazel for wisdom, the willow for healing, and the alder for endurance and craftsmanship. Celtic faith was filled with sacred animals, each one a bearer of power or wisdom. Arduina, the fierce huntress of the Ardennes, rode upon a boar, while Baco and Torc Trith embodied the wild strength of that same beast in myth and ritual. The bear was revered through deities like Artio and Matunus, symbols of courage and maternal might, and the horse was adored in the figure of Epona, the divine mare who protected riders and herds. Her cult became so popular that even Rome adopted her feast day, an extraordinary honor for a Celtic goddess. Shrines and burials with horse offerings show how deeply this animal was woven into both warfare and spirituality. Celtic mythology also joined creatures into hybrid forms that fused strength and mystery. One such being, Tarvostrigoranus, the bull with 3 cranes, appears in stone carvings alongside sacred trees and companion gods, expressing harmony between sky, earth, and water. The most powerful of all forest gods was Cernunnos, the Horned One, guardian of nature's cycles. Often shown with stag antlers and a serpent in his hand, he symbolized vitality, abundance, and the link between the mortal and divine realms. His image, immortalized on the Gundestrup cauldron, stands as one of the most iconic emblems of Celtic spirituality. Animals, too, carried prophetic and sacred meanings. Certain birds and beasts were never eaten, as they were believed to embody divine essence. The hare and the goose were protected creatures, and before battles, warriors might release a hare to divine the will of the gods. Bulls were ritually sacrificed as part of ancient fertility rites, while salmon, though rarely depicted, represented wisdom, feeding on the hazelnuts that fell into sacred rivers. In Irish legend, the salmon of knowledge gained infinite understanding from these nuts, linking animal instinct with divine insight. The skies themselves were alive with omens. Swans, symbols of the otherworld, appeared in countless Celtic tales, transforming between human and spirit form. Ravens and crows followed warriors to battle, serving as messengers of the war goddesses Macha and the Morrigan. Eagles, cranes, and owls watched over the sacred groves, their flights interpreted as signs of fate. To the Celts, every wingbeat, every animal cry, was part of a greater language of nature, a communication between the world of humans and the eternal realm of the gods. Across Celtic lands, water carried sanctity. Springs, rivers, lakes, holy wells, even sodden marshes drew offerings and prayer, so it's no surprise that their pantheon teems with water goddesses, nearly all bound to healing. Inscriptions and finds trace their footprints. Apodiva near Cologne, Arnamitia at Buxton, Mistress of the Sacred Grove, Coventina at Caraburg and Narbonne, Ianuaria in Burgundy, Icovillana at Metz and Trier, Laha in the Pyrenees, Lattis among the Cumbrian bogs, Meduna and Vercana at Bad Bertrick's curative springs, Nehelenia, patron of sailors, along the Dutch coast, Ritona or Pritona, keeper of fords in the Moselle region, Telo at the spring that named Toulon, Verbea, spirit of the river wharf. Most renowned are Boann of the Boyne, Sequana of the Seine, whose source sanctuary blossomed into a Romanized complex, and Sulis of Bath, later fused with Minerva as Sulis Minerva, where hot waters and votive altars transformed a spring into a temple city. Beyond the waters lay a host of local deities with vivid, sometimes enigmatic characters. Antonocyticus at Benwell stood life-sized in stone on Hadrian's frontier. Arausio's name lives on in Orange. In ancient Galatia, Deiotarus, the divine bull, anchored a regional cult. Ogmios, pictured by Lucian as a bald elder who drew followers by golden chains from his tongue to their ears, became an emblem of speech's binding power and, by later association, of the Ogham script and its lore. Even the crossroads had guardians, the Dei Quadriviae, goddesses of the four ways, received shrines where paths converged. Classical observers give our first sustained portrait of the priestly order. Caesar describes a hierarchy led by druids, with sweeping authority over worship, sacrifice, and judgment. Students sought them out for long years of study. Communities submitted disputes to their rulings. Those who defied them suffered ritual banishment, a civic death. Caesar even speaks of an archdruid, first among peers, elected by reputation or, he claims, decided by force if votes failed. He places their great assemblies in the Carnutes territory, imagined as Gaul's heart, and insists Britain remained the high school of Druidic doctrine. He notes their tax exemptions and military immunity, the prodigious memorization of verses in place of sacred writing, and their teaching that the soul passes on after death, an idea he frames as fuel for battlefield courage. There were moments when Roman practice faintly mirrored Celtic custom. Livy preserves an episode where a war was settled by a duel of champions, a form dear to Celtic honor codes. He also recounts early cattle raids between Romans and Albans, echoes of a pastoral economy where wealth moved on the hoof and conflict often began in the byres. These parallels do not erase the differences, but they remind us that the frontier between Celt and Roman was not a wall, but a living seam, stitched with trade, imitation, rivalry, and story. Livy leans hard on the sacred aura of kingship. In his telling, Romulus, the first truly Roman king, does not die so much as vanish into the divine. While he reviews the army on the field of Mars near the Capran Marsh, a violent storm breaks. Thunder rolls, a dense cloud drops over the ranks, and when it lifts, Romulus is gone. From that moment, Rome treats him as taken up among the gods who had endorsed his rule. Numa, who followed him and came from Sabine stock, secured his throne through carefully sought omens and priestly rites, a reminder that celestial approval could steady politics when bloodlines could not. On the ground, Romans and Celts learned from each other the hard way. As Roman power pushed into Gaul and beyond, the old pattern of summer campaigning and winter farming collapsed. Legions began to build permanent winter quarters, living season after season on Celtic frontiers. Prolonged contact bred imitation. The Romans admired the speed and shock of the Celtic two-pony chariot and borrowed it in adapted form, calling it the currus, a word that ultimately gave English its car. The Celts, seeing how lethal the short Roman sword could be at close quarters, adjusted their fighting. When long, slashing blades grew dangerous to face, Rome fielded the pilum, a heavy, thrusting spear distinct from the throwing javelin. Battlefields rang with different horns, the Celts with their long, braying war trumpets, the Romans with the shorter cornu, a tool for signals as much as for terror. Standards declared loyalties at a glance. Celtic banners flaunted boars, stags, and bulls, while Rome rallied around the eagle and, in earlier days, other beast crests, including a dragon device borne by a Draconarius. Even under the universal eagle, each legion prized its own totems, often tied to auspicious dates and sky signs in its history. Celtic pressure on Italy began with swift incursions into the Po plain. Those raids proved so successful that the northern lowlands took a new name, Gaul on this side of the Alps. The lands beyond remained Gaul beyond the Alps until Caesar remade them. In 390 BC, the Senones destroyed the Etruscan town of Clusium. Rome struck back, met them on the Allia, and lost disastrously. The Gallic host marched into Rome and sacked it. Later, writers embroidered the defense of the capital with patriotic heroics, but the strategic outcome was plain. It took Rome decades to recover its nerve. The invaders were bought off, and legend has King Brennus tipping his sword onto the ransom scale with the bitter cry, "Woe to the conquered." From then on, Roman prose speaks often of the Gallic terror, a memory that colored every later portrait of Celtic foes. Livy's scene painting captures Rome's shock. He describes a green army blundering into battle while the Gauls advanced with wild songs and clashing cries, commanders unprepared, lines breaking, soldiers scattering. The victors piled the dead men's arms into trophy mounds, as was their habit, and pressed to the city's gates, where their howls and chants carried over the walls like wolves at a fold. Celtic settlements spread across northern Italy. The Insubres made Mediolanum their stronghold. The Cenomani held Brixia, the Boii Felsina, while Senones and Lingones pushed farther south and led the sack of Rome. A century after a first treaty, Roman colonists seized Senonian land. In 225 BC at Telamon, Rome struck back with finality, cutting down tens of thousands and taking thousands more. The Insubres, Boii, Taurici, and bands of hired Gaisate took the brunt. Vengeance, long delayed, had arrived. Eastward, after Alexander's death, Celtic warbands probed into Macedonia. In 281 BC, they killed King Ptolemy Xeronis. Splits soon followed. One group under Leotarios and Leonorios moved into Asia Minor at the invitation of a Bithynian king who wanted a buffer. They carved out Galatia and ruled over Phrygian and Cappadocian populations for generations, trading in cattle, captives, and ransoms. Governance there took an unusual form for Celtic society. Each of 3 peoples was quartered under tetrarchs, with a council of 300 and a central oak sanctuary called the Druids. The old markers of kingship and druidic authority are largely absent in the sources, though at times a single ruler, like Deiotarus, rose above the rest. The Galatians shifted from Greek to Roman alliances as the winds changed and were eventually absorbed, but their language lingered. Jerome still heard it in late antiquity and likened it to the speech of Eastern Gaul. Meanwhile, Rome's greatest trial came from the south. Carthage, almost within sight of Sicily, fought 3 long wars with the Republic. The second brought Hannibal, elephants, and Celtic contingents into the same story. Vowing lifelong enmity to Rome as a child, Hannibal grew into a commander of relentless energy and rough simplicity, sleeping among sentries, first into the fight, last to quit it. He sought Celtic allies early, securing the Boii, while others wavered or betrayed him. Scouts in Massilia reported a startling column crossing the mountains with strange gray beasts, whose trunks could lift men and whose hides could shrug off iron. Hannibal rafted elephants across rivers and fought both men and terrain. Some alpine tribes fed him, others bled him. Some he crushed, then soothed with feats of single combat that won their admiration and service. For a time he spoke to chieftains in their own tongue. In the end, fragile loyalties frayed. On the Trebia, Celtic mercenaries slipped away in a whiteout when they were meant to hold the center of the line. Stories like that, paired with earlier tales of thunder-scattered raiders near Delphi, hardened a trope in classical writing. Celts as fearless and fatalistic until omens turned, then suddenly undone by the heavens' displeasure. Whether fair or not, the narrative stuck. Hannibal's campaign dissolved into partisan war and, finally, defeat at Zama. Within years, the Boii and Insubres were broken or absorbed. Cisalpine Gaul kept its name, but its soul was Romanized. On the far Atlantic edge, resistance lasted longer. Iberian and Celtiberian communities fought on, and echoes of the Old World still hum in Galicia, with its Galician tongue and music that answers to a Celtic beat. The transformation of Gaul into a Roman province was largely the result of one man's ambition: Julius Caesar. Ancient writers often praised his courage and genius, though others noted his vanity, his careful attempt to hide baldness, his pride in wearing a laurel wreath at all times, his tweezed and polished appearance. Yet beyond his personal quirks, Caesar's hunger for glory reshaped the Celtic world more deeply than any other individual before or after him. His campaigns in Gaul brought its peoples, its languages, and its independence under the shadow of Rome forever. The land Caesar conquered was vast and divided by the four great rivers that still define modern France: the Loire, the Seine, the Garonne, and the Rhône. Across these valleys lived a mosaic of Celtic tribes: the Saluvii and Allobroges near the Mediterranean, the Arverni and Ruteni in the south and west, and the Aedui, Bituriges, and Helvetii in the north and east. The Romans called this sprawling region Gallia Comata, long-haired Gaul, to distinguish it from the already subdued Gallia Transalpina, the narrow corridor that linked Italy to Spain. Rome had long coveted that southern passage for its trade routes and military access to the Iberian Peninsula. The Greek colony of Massalia, modern Marseille, was a critical ally, and the Rhône served as a commercial artery. Conflicts with the local tribes, beginning with the Saluvii and later the Allobroges, gave Rome a foothold in the area. By the time Caesar appeared, alliances and rivalries among the Celtic tribes had already created deep divisions. Some, like the Aedui, sought Rome's friendship to defend themselves against stronger enemies such as the Arverni. These internal rivalries made conquest far easier than open resistance ever could. Within Gaul itself, tribal politics were shifting. The old system of hereditary kingship began to fade, replaced by elected magistrates and councils. Among the Aedui and Helvetii, the highest official was the Vergobret, a chief magistrate chosen under the authority of the Druidic order. This development hinted at a move towards a more collective and regulated form of government, perhaps inspired by contact with the Roman Republic. Even the Nervi established a senate and crude parliamentary procedures, proof that Celtic society was far from primitive. In 58 BC, without the Senate's approval, Caesar launched his campaign. His justification, that the Helvetii threatened Rome's allies, was flimsy but effective. His armies advanced swiftly, crushing resistance. According to his own reports, hundreds of thousands perished. Even Germanic allies of Rome, such as Ariovistus, were destroyed when Caesar found their presence inconvenient. His conquests were as ruthless as they were efficient. Like many conquerors since, Caesar claimed to bring order and civilization, though his motives were personal ambition and political power. By 55 BC, most of Gaul lay under Roman control. Entire tribes, like the Nervi and Eburones, were nearly wiped out. Caesar praised their bravery in defeat, but his mercy was self-serving. He allowed some survivors to return to their lands, not out of compassion, but to prevent new tribes from seizing the empty territories. Rome's new subjects paid heavy tribute and lived under strict Roman authority. The Aedui and other collaborators were rewarded, while the rest endured a slow erosion of their culture and independence. Despite occasional revolts, the Romanization of Gaul advanced rapidly. Celtic leaders adopted Latin dress, Roman customs, and the toga in place of the plaid. Towns flourished under Roman architecture, trade networks expanded, and temples to Roman gods replaced druidic groves. After Caesar's death in 44 BC, his transformation of Gaul remained irreversible. The land was divided into new provinces: Aquitania in the south, Lugdunensis around modern Lyons, Narbonensis along the Mediterranean corridor, Belgica to the north, and the two Germanias stretching to the Rhine. Rebellions flared from time to time. The most famous was that of Vercingetorix in 52 BC, the last great stand of Celtic unity, but even later uprisings, such as those led by Julius Florus, Julius Sacrovir, and Julius Vindex, were already Roman in character. Their leaders bore Roman names and fought for political grievances, not for the restoration of Celtic freedom. Within a single century, Gaul's transformation was complete. Once, Celtic culture had stretched from the shores of Ireland to the plains of Galatia in Asia Minor. Now, its strongholds had fallen silent beneath Roman stone. Only in the mist-covered islands beyond the northern sea, Britain and Ireland, did the old Celtic spirit still survive. Far from the reach of Caesar's legions, the earliest people in Britain were not Celts. Beyond that, the picture is hazy. Graves hint at hunters, farmers, and steady advances in metalwork, much like those on the continent. But there's no distinct cultural signature as with, say, Egypt. What we do have are striking ritual landscapes: barrows and quoits, long rows of stones, timber causeways like the remarkable alignment at Flag Fen in the Fens, and the great complexes at Stonehenge, Avebury, and Silbury Hill. These sanctuaries were later reused by Celts, but they weren't built by them. There's also a whisper of very early tin working in Cornwall's streams around 2500 BC, perhaps feeding the age-old myth of a fog-bound northern land of the Hyperboreans. When the Celts arrived is uncertain. Latin art and craft appear after 250 BC, clear proof of either settlement or intense contact with Belgic groups in Gaul. Earlier incursions are possible, perhaps tied to the movements that sent Celts into Italy by the mid-1st millennium BC, but anything before about 900 BC is unlikely. A cautious outline would place Goidelic speakers in Britain and Ireland from around 900 BC, Brythonic groups from roughly 600 BC, and a later Belgic wave near the end of the 2nd century BC. Britain's hills are crowned with ancient forts. Many began before the Celts and were expanded by them. Promontory strongholds like Crickley Hill, high eyries such as Ingleborough or Carrick Fell, compact enclosed farms from later phases, and monumental works at Hembury, Sisbury, Torbury, Hambledon Hill, and the spectacular Traer Keary, with its sweeping views over North Wales. At some point, builders adopted a formidable double-wall technique, the Murus Gallicus, packing rubble between timbered faces for shock resistance, a principle echoed centuries later in Hadrian's Wall. Sacred waters kept their secrets until modern dredgers disturbed them. Lynn Fowler yielded Hallstatt-style harness and vehicle fittings and local bronze cauldrons from around 650 to 600 BC. Lynn Carrig-Bach gave up later offerings spanning the 2nd century BC to the 1st century AD. In 1984, Pete at Lindo Moss preserved the body of a carefully groomed young man laid face down in a shallow pool. He had been struck on the head, garroted, and his throat cut. His last meal a seeded bread with mistletoe pollen present, inviting comparisons to ritual killing and the triple death of sacral kings in Irish lore. Trade linked the islands to the Mediterranean long before Rome came. The Greek traveler Pytheas supposedly visited Britain before 300 BC. Parallels between 4th century BC burials in the Marne and Arras cultures elite graves with two-wheeled chariots suggest movement or tight connections across the channel. Diodorus described Cornish tin gathering, a tidal island market reached by causeway, likely St. Michael's Mount, feeding a land and sea route from southern Britain past Brittany, up the Loire or Garonne, then on to the Rhône and the wider Mediterranean. Caesar later said the Veneti controlled these maritime arteries. The older picture of pure conquest has softened. Steady commerce may have helped seed Celtic culture alongside migration. By Caesar's day, southern Britain was a patchwork of kingdoms. The Canti ruled Kent, the Trinovantes held Essex and Suffolk, the Iceni occupied Norfolk's windy flats, the Cativellani dominated the central southeast, the Atrebats and Belgae lay to the south, the Durotriges spread across Dorset and Somerset, and the Dumnoni held Devon and Cornwall. West of the Severn stood the Silures, farther west the Demetae, and across central and north Wales the Ordovices, with the Decheangli on the northeastern coast. In the northwest, the Cornovi stretched from the Mersey inland. The Parisi held a small triangle north of the Humber. The great Corieltovi spanned the East Midlands. The Brigantes ruled most of the north, and the Carvetti anchored the northwest around Carlisle. Caesar's first crossing in 55 BC did little beyond wrecking ships in a storm. The second, in 54 BC, met the chariot tactics of Cassivellaunus, a commander-king coordinating southern resistance. He praised the Britons' skill, hurtling in to scatter ranks with noise and speed, leaping down to fight on foot, then springing back as drivers wheeled the light wicker cars away, cavalry's mobility with infantry's staying power. Cassivellaunus was beaten, compelled to pay tribute, and barred from attacking the Trinovantes, who had submitted. A generation later, power coalesced under Cunobelinus of the Catuvellauni, remembered as Cymbeline. His name weds the battle-hound to Bel, the bright warrior god. Though Catuvellonian by blood, he made his seat at Camulodunum, later Roman Colchester, the sacred center of the conquered Trinovantes. The choice was strategic for trade along the Thames and politically potent as an invocation of Camelos, a war deity whose name survives across Britain and Gaul and echoes through place names that later fed the romance of Camelot. Conquest came in earnest under Claudius in AD 43. The new emperor needed a resounding victory to cement his rule, and Britain, with Caesar's unfinished business attached to it, offered just that. The invasion succeeded, and over 4 centuries, Roman and Celtic ways fused into a Romano-British culture. Villas and roads spread, but the old loyalties were slow to die. Where Caesar had dismissed Britons as little better than slaves, the more perceptive verdict was simpler. They could endure taxes, levies, and the burdens of rule, so long as power stayed within bounds. Cross that line, and a people accustomed to obedience would bristle at the first scent of servitude. Southern Britain was the first to bend toward Rome. The newcomers brought their own vocabulary with them, oppidum for a town smaller than a true city, sometimes no more than a stockaded height or fenced wood. As these places hardened into garrison hubs, castra, military camps, took shape, a word that still lingers in names ending in Chester, Cester, and Castor. Among the earliest to take on a Roman face were Chichester, Winchester, and Silchester. On the eve of conquest, Cunobelinus died and left his realm to a quarrel among his sons, Caraticus, Togodomnus, and Adminius. Adminius bolted to the imperial court, where Caligula theatrically proclaimed him king of Britain, though no legion yet held the island. After Claudius's invasion, this habit of appointing client monarchs hardened into policy. So ingrained was native loyalty to royal lineages that when the fleet commander Carausius tried to seize the islands during Diocletian's partition of the empire, he styled himself King of Britain to claim that allegiance. The first occupation forces, Tuus Augusta, Naintu Hispana, Fortuntus Gemina, and Dectiex Valeria, arrived with a motley of auxiliaries from across Europe. Aulus Plautius, the first consular governor, was a capable soldier but a harsh, clumsy administrator. His successor, Ostorius Scapula, pressed hard against the Silures, drove Caratacus north to seek shelter among the Brigantes, and at length secured his capture. Within a decade, some native rulers were already courting Rome. Cogidubnus became the prototype client, rewarded with titles and an official role in the province. An inscription from Chichester names him as Tiberius Claudius Cogidubnus, king and imperial legate in Britain, a Romanized gloss on a name likely born as Blackhead. Adoption of imperial nomen must have sounded absurd to unassimilated Britons, yet it spread alongside royal coin portraits. Native and client kings, among them Cunobelinus, Commius, Tincomius, Tassiovanus, and Verica, had money struck in their names. The pre-conquest sacred site at Wanborough yielded heaps of such coins beneath Roman layers, proof that the sanctuary mattered long before legionaries raised altars there. Commius himself was a Gaul of the Atrebates, who had cousins across the Channel. He once ferried cavalry to aid Caesar's second crossing and cut down Britons in Rome's name, yet later fled to Britain, rebuilt his standing, and likely founded the sanctuary on Hayling Island that blossomed under Roman rule. After Scapula came Didius Gallus and Veranius, neither memorable. Suetonius Paulinus, tougher and shrewder, extended the frontier, and in 61 led a ruthless strike against the Druidic stronghold on Anglesey. Why he chose extermination over Rome's usual policy of co-opting cults remains unclear. The same year, Boudica of the Iceni ignited a revolt that burned Camulodunum, Verulamium, and Londinium to the ground before Paulinus broke it. He was then replaced by the diplomat Petronius Turpilianus, followed by Trebellius Maximus and Vettius Bolanus. By 71, the south lay quiet. Under Vespasian, Petilius Cerealis battered the Brigantes, Julius Frontinus harried the Silures. In 78, Agricola took the governorship. His son-in-law Tacitus preserves the arc of that campaign season by season, as Caratacus's resistance faded, client queens bargained, and garrisons crept north and west. The far southwest fell quickly and stayed marginal. Traces of Rome there are few. Wales fought harder. Anglesey's priestly center was put to the sword. The north remained the hardest theater, eventually fenced with stone and turf. Hadrian ordered a barrier spanning coast to coast, roughly 73 miles of wall, 8 feet thick, at least 15 to the rampart walk, with a parapet above, a broad ditch northward, a rear entrenchment, and mile castles garrisoned by squads of 50. A generation later, the Antonine Wall, turf over stone between Forth and Clyde, pushed the line north, but proved short-lived and was soon abandoned. Legions settled into a chain: 20 Valeria at Camulodunum, 9 Hispana in the north and later at Lincoln, 14 Gemina in the Midlands, 2 Augusta regrouped at Exeter. At one point, Nero weighed abandoning Britain altogether. Merchants sensed the wind change. Seneca called in loans to tribal rulers, panic rippled through the province, and discontent fed revolt. In the longer struggle, Agricola briefly reached deep into Caledonia and won at Mons Gropius, where the plain ran red and the forests echoed with ambush and counter-ambush before the Britons scattered into pathless wilds, and the weary pursuit fell away at nightfall. He toyed with the idea of subduing Hibernia as well, judging a single legion and stout auxiliaries sufficient. But neither Ireland nor Scotland ever became provinces. Power itself shifted meanings under occupation. Tacitus contrasts older kings with later chiefs, implying that sacred kingship had already begun to splinter into faction when Rome arrived. Religions braided together. Celtic deities took Roman surnames and shared altars. Mithras found followers among the troops, with underground rites that would have felt at home beside springs and sacred pools. Two chalk giants mark the early Romano-British landscape. The coursing white horse at Uffington, twin in style to bronze horses and coinage from Atrebatic country, and the club-bearing figure at Terne Abbas, a raw emblem of generative force once ringed with maypoles and village dances. Sanctuaries flourished. On the Severn Heights at Lydney, a healing complex honored Nodans, kin in name to Nuada of the Silver Hand. Visitors bathed, slept in the Abaton for dream cures, and pinned bronze letters, often in the form of dogs, to spell out pleas and thanks. Sun chariots, sea creatures, anchors, and the river's famous boar threaded the imagery. At Bath, the great hot springs drew pilgrims from across the province. The goddess Sulis, radiant with wisdom and warmth, merged with Minerva. Thousands of coins glinted in the pool. Altars rose to Mars Lucetius, Nemetona, the Triple Mother, and the pairing of Mercury and Rosmerta. Farther north, Buxton's Waters of Arnamitia set a similar pattern in the land of the Coriel Tovi. Britain supplied the empire with grain. Barley and oats ferried to Rhine garrisons, lead from Mendip, tin from Cornwall, precious metals, and even dark, bluish pearls. In return came wine, rabbits, and kitchen gardens studded with cherries and peas. After Constantius reasserted central control in London, the 4th century glowed with prosperity, and medallions hailed him as restorer of the eternal light. His son Constantine, later woven into Celtic storytelling as Costentin, reunited the empire and left his name on a Cornish parish. Assimilation, meanwhile, moved from edict to appetite. Agricola built forums and houses, praised the eager, chided the idle, and educated chiefs' sons in polished rhetoric. Latin ceased to grate and began to charm. The toga appeared in streets once wrapped in plaid. Arcades, baths, and feasts spread across the towns. Many Britons called this progress. Tacitus, dry-eyed, called it another face of servitude. When Constantine died, he embraced Christianity, which endured in the islands under the care of the Celtic Church until Augustine's mission. Pressure mounted on the frontiers. Picts and Caledonians poured over the wall. Irish fleets struck Chester and Caerleon under Nile of the 9 hostages. Saxon raiders harried the east. Through it all, the new faith took root, carried by monks and memory long after imperial standards faded from the hills. When Roman authority finally collapsed in 436, Britain was left exposed to new waves of invaders from across the North Sea. Angles, Saxons, and Jutes poured into the island from the east, bringing with them unfamiliar gods and rough new tongues. Their speech, Anglish, would evolve into English. The old Celtic deities faded. Woden, Thor, and Freya replaced Lugh, Bel, and Brigid. The newcomers drove the native Britons westward, calling them Welas, foreigners, a word that became Welsh. Those who fled south of the Severn were also Welas, and their land, stretching across Somerset, Devon, and Cornwall, was long known as West Wales. Amid this chaos, a few Celtic rulers still resisted. One of them, remembered as Arthur, became the hero of legend. His bard, The mysterious Taliesin, whose name means shining brow, later inspired the figure of Merlin. Arthur, most likely a Christian war leader shaped by lingering Roman traditions, fell at Camlan around 550, the same era in which St. David began preaching Christianity in Wales. For centuries afterward, the Celts' culture survived mainly through oral tales, pagan myths intertwined with Christian miracles, stories where gods, saints, and mortal heroes shared the same stage. In one tale, Pwyll, Prince of Dyfed, spends a year ruling the underworld in place of its king, while saints like Meriasek and Pyrrhon wander across Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany performing wonders, striking the ground to summon holy springs, or sailing the sea on a stone. The Germanic advance pushed steadily onward. At the Battle of Diorum in 577, Saxon victory split the Britons north and south of the Bristol Channel, sealing the fate of the Western Celts as the Welsh. Some, forced out of Devon and Cornwall, crossed the sea to Armorica in Gaul, where they founded a new homeland, Brittany, land of the Britons. When Augustine arrived at Thanet in 597 to begin converting the Anglo-Saxons, the island's religious landscape was already a tangle of old Celtic faiths, fading Norse gods, and isolated Christian communities. The Celtic Church, long independent, resisted the tightening control of Rome during the 7th and 8th centuries, clashing with missionaries and Roman-appointed bishops. Yet monasteries multiplied across the land. Peterborough, Whitby, Ripon, Ely, Lichfield, Hereford, Gloucester, Winchester, and Wells rose within a single generation. By the 9th century, Saxon power dominated the map. King Egbert of Wessex subdued Mercia at Ellendun in 825 and was hailed 3 years later as overlord of England. When Cornish kings, aided by Danish warriors, rebelled in 835, he crushed them, a final echo of Celtic independence in a land now bound under Saxon rule. The Norman conquest of 1066 completed the transformation. Old English merged with Norman French, reshaping the language and leaving traces of class and conquest. Peasants tended cows, sheep, and pigs, while nobles dined on beef, mutton, and pork. As England's speech evolved, Celtic tongues retreated westward to the mountains and peninsulas of the Atlantic fringe. Cumbria lost its native voice entirely. Cornwall held out in language and spirit, but slowly yielded, its speech shrinking to the remote western moors. Welsh endured, fortified by a printed Bible that helped preserve its identity. Ireland and Scotland, though deeply entangled with their English neighbors, never lost their sense of separate nationhood. The Celts, scattered but unbroken, carried their ancient spirit into the edges of the Western world. Ireland takes its name from the goddess Eriu, one of the divine figures of Celtic myth. According to the medieval Book of Invasions, the island's history began with a series of arrivals by mysterious peoples: the Cessair, the Partholons, the Nemedians, the Fir Bolg, the Tuatha De Danann, and finally the Milesians, who were said to be the ancestors of the Irish themselves. When the Milesians conquered the island, Eriu and her sisters Banba and Fodla each asked that the land bear her name. But it was Eriu's that endured. In return, she promised the newcomers eternal rule over Ireland. The defeated Tuatha De Danann withdrew into the hidden places of the world, beneath hills, lakes, and mounds, where, it was said, they still lived as the unseen Aossi, the fairy folk. Many of Ireland's ancient towns were also thought to take their names from goddesses. Tara, the seat of the High Kings, was linked with the goddess Ti. Tailtiu, the site of ancient games, with a deity of the same name. and Emain Macha, capital of Ulster, with the war goddess Macha. Ireland's mythology is rich with powerful women, and its landscape reflects their lingering presence. Eriu herself was a sun goddess, joined to the god Mac Grain, the son of the sun, and every mortal king was regarded as her consort for the span of his reign. His rule was a sacred marriage between man, land, and divinity, a bond believed to ensure the fertility of fields and people alike. This fusion of spirituality and kingship gave Ireland its deep sense of the mystical, a conviction that the eternal lies just beyond the visible world. From that belief sprang the legend of Tir na Nog, the land of youth, said to shimmer beyond the western sea. Such spirituality never vanished from Ireland's spirit. Even in later Christian centuries, faith remained intense, transformed perhaps, but not replaced. The divine once expressed through Danu, Brigid, and the Dagda now flowed through saints and abbots. The idea that sacred power could pass between realms endured as well. In Irish tradition, the barriers between this world and the other world were thin, easily crossed by visionaries, kings, and poets alike. This outlook blurred the line between myth and history, so that legendary kings and real rulers often merged in the memory. The island of Innisfallen, on the lakes near Killarney, carries one such echo of that belief. There, legend tells of an abbot who followed a bird's song around the island for what seemed a single day, only to return centuries later, unchanged. To the monks, he had stepped through time, tasting eternity. Stories like these fill Ireland's countryside, binding the modern land to its mythic past. Places such as Tara or Navan Fort still radiate that invisible power, reminders that ancient and modern Ireland remain intertwined. Archaeology, however, paints a different picture from the medieval chronicles. The supposed waves of invasion are not supported by evidence of distinct settlements. The artifacts suggest a gradual evolution from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age, influenced by continental Hallstatt and Latin styles, rather than sudden conquests. Some objects, like the golden torque from Clonmacnoise, were likely imported, but the broader culture grew organically. Because Ireland and the Scottish Highlands were never under Roman rule, there are no classical records, only later Christian manuscripts written centuries after the events they describe, layering myth upon fragmentary memory. The traditional invasion story unfolds like a sacred drama. The Cessair were said to be divine women led by a descendant of Noah, whose consort Fintan survived the flood by transforming into animals. The Partholons came next, restoring fertility to the land but perishing in a plague. Then came Nemed and his followers, whose name echoes the sacred groves of the druids. After them, the Firbolg held Ireland until the arrival of the Tuatha Dé Danann, magical beings who brought with them 4 treasures: a prophetic stone that cried out for true kings, Lug's spear of victory, Nuada's unstoppable sword, and the Dagda's cauldron of endless plenty. They descended upon Ireland hidden in storm clouds, darkening the skies for days. The Tuatha Dé Danann became the gods of Ireland: Danu, Lugh, Nuada of the Silver Hand, the Dagda, Brigid, Manannán mac Lir, and the battle goddess Morrigan among them. They fought the monstrous Fomorians, sea-born giants with twisted limbs and single glaring eyes, until the final invaders, the Milesians, arrived from Spain. Led by Mil Espain, they defeated the Tuatha and took the island as their own. The Tuatha retreated beneath the earth, and the Milesians became the mortal Irish people. From this blend of divine and human ancestry emerged the Gaels, whose name and language still define Ireland today. Later legends traced their origins even further, to an Egyptian named Gaudal Glas, cured of a serpent's bite by Moses, whose descendants journeyed through Spain before reaching Ireland. From Gaudal's line came Miel and his wife Scota, whose name gave rise to both the tribe of the Scotti and the land of Scotland. Such tales, half myth and half genealogy, reveal more about the Irish imagination than about literal history. Modern science reminds us that Celtic is a culture, not a race. The Irish, though among the most Celtic in spirit, are a tapestry of ancestries, Anglo-Norman, English, Norse, and far older local strains. High frequencies of blood type O and the striking contrast of dark hair with light eyes hint at deep pre-Celtic roots, while the fiery red hair so often associated with Ireland may owe as much to Viking blood as to mythic descent. What endures most strongly, however, is not lineage but identity, the enduring Irish sense that myth, faith, and history are threads of the same endless story. For centuries, the origin legends of Ireland were treated as literal history, much like the polished narratives of Nennius and Geoffrey of Monmouth were in Britain. They were orderly, devout, and satisfying. Biblical timelines dovetailed with native myth. Present politics gained ancient backing, and audiences were thoroughly entertained. In Ireland, these tales had an additional job, anchoring the pedigree of the High Kings. A key ancestral figure was styled Aithecta, descended from Magog, from Japheth, from Noah, a lineage crafted to sanctify rule. In modern times, the same story weave helped fuel romantic nationalism. Unlike the continental and British Celts, who appear often in Greco-Roman accounts, the Irish rarely step onto the classical stage. Hibernia is the name most writers used, though Scotia and other forms occur. A handful of authors, Orpheus, Aristotle, Plutarch, offer little more than distant labels. Others indulged in lurid caricature. Pomponius Mela praised the grass and maligned the people. Strabo and Jerome parroted tales of savagery. Solinus imagined blood rites. None of these accusations are backed by credible evidence. One obscure compiler even claimed to have visited numerous Irish clans and palaces, yet left nothing useful beyond the boast. Archaeology tells a different, quieter story. Mesolithic dwellings along Lough Neagh and the Bann suggest early communities of fishers moving by coast and river. By the Late Bronze Age, a distinctive pottery appears, and coracle-like skin boats, the curras, take to the water, a Stone Age invention still bobbing on Atlantic swells in recent centuries. Ireland's megaliths stand out in their preservation, from the passage tombs of Newgrange and Noath to scattered court cairns. Their density north of the Boyne points to local builders rather than foreign colonies. Pinning down a Celtic arrival date is slippery. Literary chronologies push heroic settlers back to the first millennium before Christ, yet material signs of clearly Celtic metalwork do not show strongly until the 2nd century BC. As elsewhere, the shift was gradual. Languages, styles, and beliefs seeped in, mingled with what was already there, and took Irish shape. Even features of modern Irish syntax may preserve the bones of pre-Celtic speech beneath later Gaelic vocabulary. Oats, which thrive in damp soil, became the island's signature grain, aligning diet and agriculture with climate. Irish defenses mirrored wider Celtic patterns, but with local names and forms. Lake dwellings known as crannogs rose on timber islands, linked to shore by narrow walks. Earthen ringworks called raths formed concentric ramparts on gentler ground, while in stonier regions these hardened into cashels, dry stone fortresses like the Grianan of Ailich, Steg Fort, and the great cliff-sided Dún Aungasa on the Aran Islands. Underground passages, souterrains, snake beneath certain sites, especially in Ulster. Their purpose remains debated. Cold stores, refuges, sanctuaries, ritual ways, likely all of the above, in different places and times. Beyond the visible strengthens lay the Siege, the mounded strongholds of the other world. In Irish thought, those green humps were doorways, the dwellings of powers that never truly left when new peoples arrived. Political life was layered and precise. Society clustered into tribes and septs led by kings and queens, with a patchwork of small kingdoms under the shadow of a paramount ruler, the High King. Myth blurs with history here, but beneath the glow of legend stands a working system. The word for a people and their territory was tuath, each with a territorial king. Land was measured in practical units, a baile biatai, enough to feed and graze multiple herds, subdivided into plowlands called sias racha. Status flowed along a finely graded ladder. Royals and nobles, learned professionals such as druids, poets, and healers, wealthy cattle lenders known as boer, and bands of clients bound by networks of obligation called silsine. At the margins lived dependents and strangers, yet even the lowest retained a path upward through effort and wealth, and the law, rooted in learned tradition, shielded all ranks. That law, later glossed and organized by Christian scholars, survives in the Brean corpus. Rulings once spoken in poetic riddles, later explained by compilers such as Cormac, and framed in introductions that claimed to preserve every just judgment that harmonized with the new faith. Kingship followed these laws and the deeper logic of ritual. Heirs were chosen from a royal kin group, not simply by birth order. Physical wholeness and proven prowess mattered. Druidic discernment, visions, ordeals, signs could tip the scales, and succession struggles were frequent enough that the practice of naming a designated heir, the tanist, arose to steady the line. Tribute moved down the chain of overlords and clients as cattle, cloaks, ornaments, and blades. Feasting and hospitality cemented bonds. Guests bathed in scented water. Musicians played. Storytellers, seanchaitha, recited genealogies and hero tales. And serious matters might be decided over a board game of ficheol. Tara, sacred seat of high kingship, stands at the heart of this imagined and enacted order. Ritual there was steeped in symbolism, a visionary bull sleep by which a druid sought the image of the rightful king, and the famed stone of Fall, said to cry out beneath the true sovereign's hand. Emain Macha, near Armagh, anchored the Ulster cycle, home to Conchobar MacNessa and the fierce exploits of Cu Chulainn in the Tyne Bo Cuailnge, its very name recalling the goddess Macha and her fatal race. Ireland's deepest fault line, meanwhile, is older than modern politics. The legends divide the island between north and south in the aftermath of the Milesian conquest, when rival brothers split authority. Over time, this became a symbolic map. The north as the home of rhetoric and learning, the south as the realm of music and art. Later tradition named the northern half the half of Conn, and the south the half of Moog, with the long ridge of Esker Riada running from Galway Bay to Dublin as a natural divider. Another layer defines the island as the 5/5, Ulster, Connacht, Leinster, Munster, and the central realm of Meath, an old arrangement still audible in modern Irish. The word for province, cuig, literally means a fifth, a linguistic relic of a political landscape that binds myth, law, and land into a single, enduring idea. Early Irish literature preserves a remarkable genre called the dinseanchas, often rendered poems of place, or geographical poems. These works do much more than point out hills and rivers. They braid landscape with memory, telling how features of the land gained their names, their sacred charge, and their role in history. Composed in strict, song-like patterns, short stanzas with tight rhyme and a fixed syllable count, they turn coastlines, headlands, plains, and forts into living archives. A typical piece might praise a promontory not only for the tides that strike it, but for the tides of warriors, horses, and hounds that once surged across it in legend. Taken together, the Dinsianchas sketch a personality for each of Ireland's ancient provinces. Connaught in the west is the hearth of learning, home to gifted judges, poets, and wonder-workers. Its people are celebrated for eloquence and fair dealing. Ulster to the north stands for fierce courage, swagger, rivalry, and the proud temper of battle. Its queens and goddesses are never far from war and death. Leinster in the east figures as the province of prosperity and welcome, a doorway for costly imports, and famed for noble speech and striking beauty. Munster in the south is the country of music and craft, of harpers, expert chess players, and accomplished horsemen. Its fairs are said to outshine all others. Meath in the center embodies stewardship and kingship, for here stands Tara, the ceremonial seat of the High King, ringed by the vast earthwork known as the Wrath of the Kings. Ireland's great story cycles map neatly onto this old geography. The Ulster tales, crowned by the deeds of Cú Chulainn, revolve around clashes between Ulster and Connaught. The myths of the Tuatha De Danann often unfold in Connaught, where that divine people are said to have first descended from the clouds. The Fenian lore of Fionn mac Cumhail belongs chiefly to Munster. Even personal names echo across the sea. Fionn, meaning fair or white, mirrors the Brythonic Gwyn, still enshrined in English place names that begin with Wyn. Beyond Tara, several royal centres shaped the island's political map. Emen Macha, near Armagh, anchored Ulster's kings. Dun Ailinn in Kildare served Leinster. At Rathcrogan in Roscommon, the kings of Connaught held court beside a revered entrance to the otherworld, and for generations the site hosted great fairs and druidic assemblies. Over time, the ancient provinces were divided into counties. Ulster includes Antrim, Armagh, Down, Fermanagh, Derry, and Tyrone. Leinster holds Carlow, Cavan, Monaghan, Lowis, Offaly, Dublin, Kildare, Kilkenny, Longford, Louth, Meath, Westmeath, Wexford, and Wicklow. Munster encompasses Clare, Cork, Kerry, Limerick, Tipperary, and Waterford. Connaught comprises Donegal, Galway, Leitrim, Mayo, Roscommon, and Sligo. From the late 3rd century, Irish raiders repeatedly struck Britain. Latin writers called them Scotti, not a clan name, but a label meaning plunderers. The word lives on in modern Irish in terms tied to reckoning and compensation, the root of the phrase scot-free. Among these leaders, Niall of the Nine Hostages stands out as one of the first clearly historical kings. His power base lay at Tara. His descendants, the Uí Né, dominated north and south, while launching forays onto the British mainland. We can date his attacks on Chester and Caerleon to the late 4th century, and his death to a sea battle early in the 5th. Names tangled as peoples moved. The old Gaelic name for Scotland was Alba. At times, Albion drifted to mean England. For centuries, some writers still used Scotia for Ireland, and Irish scholars abroad could be styled Scots while meaning Irishmen. Only in the High Middle Ages did the word Scot settle onto the people of what we now call Scotland. Irish settlement in western Scotland coalesced into Dalriata, a realm straddling Antrim and Argyll, whose founders were said to have sailed from Munster through the channel of Sruth na Mawile. The kingdom's lineage is credited with giving rise to major Highland kindreds. In the 6th century, Dalriata in Scotland asserted independence, sharing the land uneasily with the Picts. A century and a half later, Kenneth MacAlpin forged a new kingship over most of the country. Thereafter, the land came to be called Scotia Minor, while Ireland retained, for a time, the title Scotia Major, until habit and history fixed Scotland alone as Scotia. Amid these tides of war and migration, a Romano-British youth named Magonus was seized by Irish raiders near Carlisle and sold into bondage. After 6 years, he escaped to Gaul, returned to Britain, entered holy orders, and later took the Roman name Patricius. Around the mid-5th century, he crossed back to Ireland as a bishop, establishing his seat at Armagh within walking distance of Emain Macha. Remembered now as St. Patrick, he helped set in motion a monastic flowering that remade the island. Within 2 centuries, Ireland had become one of Christendom's great beacons. The Irish Church grew in a distinctively Celtic way, centered on monasteries rather than diocesan structures. Places like Clonmacnoise and Glendalough drew students and pilgrims from across Europe at a time many later called dark. Writers describe Ireland's hospitality to foreign learners, food, books, and instruction offered freely. From these houses, scholars and missionaries traveled far, bearing learning and faith. Dazzling manuscripts such as the Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the Book of Durrow emerged from this fusion of Irish, Anglo-Saxon, and Pictish art. During these centuries, Ogham inscriptions multiplied on memorial stones, and the script itself passed into Britain through Irish communities in Wales. The old belief in the force of rightly spoken words, truth set against the world, infused both law and learning, and the god of eloquence in earlier myth became the personified patron of the very alphabet. The calm did not last. Viking longships burned Lindisfarne at the close of the 8th century, and within 2 years their prows cut into Dublin Bay. Settlements soon lined the Shannon, and a new era began, reshaping Irish life. After the Norse came the Anglo-Normans, then the English crown's power, and with each wave more changes, more entanglements, and the long, painful strands that lead toward the island's later religious and political divisions. Vercingetorix and Vortigern were Celtic rulers who gambled on politics and steel alike. They lived centuries apart and faced very different enemies, yet both tried to steer their peoples through storms by mixing audacity with calculation. Vercingetorix struggled against Julius Caesar and met his fate at Alesia in 52 BC. Vortigern tangled with Saxon war leaders such as Hengist and Horsa in the 5th century. Each man first treated rivals as partners, only to discover those partnerships could turn on a blade. Long before the historical and legendary Arthurs reshaped Britain's imagination, these two figures modeled a distinctly Celtic style of kingship: personal bravery, battlefield prowess, elaborate intrigue, fierce honor, and ambition that reached past the horizon. In France, Vercingetorix still embodies defiant nationhood. Vortigern, deft and controversial, remains half-wrapped in myth. Different men, different aims, same archetype of the warrior king. Born among the Arverni of central Gaul, Vercingetorix was the son of Celtillus, a man executed by his own nobles for reaching too high. Caesar had judged the Arverni subdued and complacent. He misread the moment. Vercingetorix rallied followers with commanding speech and ruled with iron severity. keeping hesitant allies in line through grim punishment. By 52, BC Caesar's arm had stretched over most of Gaul, yet the massive central simmered. News from Rome of political chaos and the winter barrier of the Cevennes convinced many tribes the time had come. Nobles met in deep woods to whisper of liberty and of a single war leader. Vercingetorix emerged with a title no Gaul had worn before: King over Gaul. One by one, powerful peoples joined him, from the Arverni to the Parisii, Santoni, and Aquitani. Caesar shattered the assumption that winter would pin him south. Soldiers hacked snow from mountain paths and hustled their commander across the Cevennes into Arvernian lands, while the tribes still thought themselves safe behind nature's wall. Swift cavalry raids announced his return. Vercingetorix struck back by targeting Rome's clients. He moved first against the Bituriges. Their overlords, the Aedui, marched to help, and then turned back at the Loire, pleading doubt and danger. The Bituriges promptly switched sides. Gaul now divided and redivided as chieftains weighed rich treaties against bitter memories of tribute and hostages. Everyone sensed the year would decide everything. Either Rome's grip would choke the country, or the whole land would breathe free. The war that followed hinged less on set-piece clashes than on supplies and fortifications. Vercingetorix ordered towns burned, bridges cut, storehouses emptied, anything to starve the legions. The scale and coordination were astonishing for a society rooted in local loyalties. Messengers flew, scouts kept watch, and whole tribes took orders from leaders not their own. In siegecraft, the Gauls proved inventive and quick to learn. They snared Roman wall hooks with ropes and winches, collapsed terraces by tunneling, and countermined the galleries beneath their walls with sharpened stakes, boiling pitch, and crushing stones. At Avaricum, Vercingetorix positioned cavalry on heights above marshy ground to tempt Caesar into a trap. When the Roman withdrew, rather than blunder forward, some Gallic nobles accused their king of scheming for power with Caesar's help. He outtalked the charge and held the coalition together. The Romans eventually took Avaricum and butchered its people, yet the catastrophe oddly strengthened Vercingetorix. He had urged the town's destruction in advance as part of the Scorched Earth plan. The defeat looked like proof that his hard counsel had been right. His stature swelled from gifted commander to chosen leader. The divine favor that Celtic kings claimed seemed to shine from him, and men accepted unheard-of tasks, building siege works, marching under foreign chieftains, setting aside clan pride for a national cause. Caesar then attacked Gergovia in Arvernian country. Fate and politics tilted against him. Among the Aedui, Rome's staunchest allies, a vicious dispute over the chief magistracy broke open. Caesar stepped in, declared one contender ineligible by Aeduan law, and installed the other. Within weeks, the man he had favored took gold from the Arverni and pushed the Aedui to break with Rome. Caesar suddenly stood isolated in hostile country, cut off from his lieutenant Labienus and starved of supplies. Vercingetorix moved to finish him. He seized Novia Dunum on the Loire, where Caesar had parked hostages, grain, coin, and baggage. The garrison and merchants were slaughtered, captives sent inland, treasure seized, grain burned or dumped into the river, and the town set alight rather than left for Roman use. Caesar swallowed the humiliation and refused retreat. He drove his men across the flood-swollen Loire, wading with weapons held high while cavalry fought the current upstream. He clawed his way north to reunite with Labienus and summoned German horse to stiffen his cavalry. Sensing weakness, Vercingetorix attacked again and miscalculated. The reinforced Roman lines held. The new cavalry cut deep. Forced back, the Gallic king withdrew into the hilltop stronghold of Alesia. Caesar answered with engineering on a monumental scale, ringing the heights with inner and outer lines bristling with towers, ditches, palisades, stakes, and pits. 13 miles of earth and timber turned Alesia into a trap for those within and a barrier to those coming to the rescue. It unfolded as a textbook encirclement. Hunger tightened its grip on the garrison, despite Vercingetorix's careful rationing of grain and livestock, and the death penalty for hoarding. Even so, he slipped messengers through the Roman works to summon every tribe in Gaul. Caesar understood the stakes. If the relief broke through, Rome would likely fall back to the southern province. Ancient figures are almost certainly inflated, but even trimmed, the relief host was immense. The largest Celtic army ever gathered. Peoples from across Gaul answered. The Aedui with their clients, the Arverni with their allies from the central highlands, the seafaring Armorican communities, great river tribes like the Sequani, Senones, and Carnutes, and many more from the north and east. Caesar claims he faced barely 50,000 legionaries against 250,000 Gauls. Exaggeration or not, the scale was unprecedented. Yet the one leader who could make so many nations move as one was trapped inside Alesia. The field command fell to a foursome: Commius of the Atrebates, the Aeduan nobles Viridomarus and Epirodorix, and Vercassivellaunus, cousin to Vercingetorix, shadowed by a crowd of dignitaries keen to defend their own tribal honor as much as the common cause. Without a single commanding voice, coordination frayed. Daring assaults hammered the Roman rings, one night attack nearly bursting through as trumpets blared from the hillfort and missiles rained from the Roman towers. But the entanglements, pitfalls, and layered ramparts bled the impetus from each charge. Reserve cohorts, held well back, moved where the line bowed. By dawn, the outer army had not broken the shackles, and the garrison, delayed by filling ditches and hauling devices to the walls, fell back when word came that the attempt had failed. Fresh sorties followed, brave and costly. When Sedulus of the Lemovices fell and Vercassivellaunus was taken, resolve dissolved. The relief force scattered homeward. Vercingetorix yielded the next day. What followed was grim. Ancient writers speak of 1 million dead in the Gallic wars, and another 1 million enslaved. When a pocket of resistance at Uxellodunum finally collapsed, Caesar ordered the right hands of the captives cut off as a warning. Tribes were crushed by tribute and famine, while the conqueror banked fortune and fame. Rome granted him an unheard-of 20 days of public thanksgiving. Vercingetorix was kept alive in a Roman cell for 6 years, useful as a living symbol of futility, then paraded in chains in Caesar's triumph of 46 BC and killed at its end. Centuries later, France still argued over Alesia's exact site. Excavations at Alise-Saint-Reine revealed ditches, entrenchments, weapons, and mass remains that match the siege, and the modest town today wears the memory with quiet pride. Vortigern belongs to a later, murkier age, where chronicle blends with legend. In myth, he is the usurper who topples a monastic king, only to be driven out by Aurelius Ambrosius, and later eclipsed by Uther Pendragon, father of Arthur. The stories multiply. A doomed tower beneath Snowdon that collapses each night. A fatherless boy named Emrys, who reveals a pool beneath the foundations. 2 dragons, white and red, rising to fight. The red ultimately prevailing as a bear from Cornwall seals the victory. The symbols are plain enough. Saxon intruders pitted against native Britons, the red dragon of the Britons gaining its long afterlife in Welsh heraldry. the bear pointing toward Arthur. Strip away the marvels, and a harder outline remains. Vortigern appears to have ruled over a coalition in southern Britain as Rome's authority faded. Picts and Irish raiders pressed from the north and west. Seeking muscle, he struck a bargain with the newcomers led by Hengist and Horsa, granting land in exchange for service. The newcomers landed in Kent and Thanet, and soon fought their hosts. Battles followed, Horsa died, Kent hardened into a Jutish realm, and the long westward squeeze of the Britons began. The annals remember treacherous parley turned massacre, the so-called Night of the Long Knives, and Vortigern's flight toward the mountains. Later writers place his end in a burning tower or a lonely valley on the Line Peninsula. Meanwhile, Ambrosius emerges in sober texts as the Roman-British captain who rallied survivors and won early victories, opening the path to Uther and then to Arthur, who is first described not as king, but as war leader. Set beside each other, the two rulers look like opposites: Vercingetorix, the heroic resister; Vortigern, the failed fixer who invited wolves through the gate. Reality is more tangled. Both aimed beyond the tribe toward something like a nation, a rarity in the Celtic world. Both learned from Rome, Vercingetorix in logistics, siegecraft, and coalition politics, Vortigern in the arts of state, negotiation, and using foreign auxiliaries. Both showed the classic traits of Celtic kingship: fierce pride, personal courage, stern discipline, a sense of destiny, and both met the familiar Celtic ending of a grand effort that falls short. One endures as a martyr of independence, the other as a cautionary tale. Their different worlds largely explain their different fates. Their shared reach for unity shows how alike they really were. Unlike Vercingetorix and Vortigern, Cartimandua and Boudica stood on the same historical stage, which makes setting them side by side much simpler. The recurring motifs are familiar: pledges kept and broken, high-minded defiance, and cold-blooded pragmatism. It is tempting to cast Boudica as the uncompromising fighter and Cartimandua as the smooth negotiator. Yet the urge to label one heroine and the other traitor rarely survives close inspection. The most striking fact, before anything else, is that both were women commanding nations in an age when such authority still startled outsiders. Women held unusual standing in early Celtic society. Apart from small Pythagorean enclaves that allowed women to teach, the ancient world offered few comparable examples. Classical writers describe Celtic women mediating disputes and delivering judgments. Marriage was entered by choice, property was shared, and inheritance could pass in full to the surviving partner. We know from the Iceni that a king could leave lands and rights directly to his daughters. Some sources even report forms of shared marriage and matrilinear descent, accounts often dismissed as Roman propaganda, but not impossible in parts of Gaul. Inscriptions and offerings show women trading and owning businesses in their own names. On the march, women drove supply wagons and, when needed, fought. Writers from Polybius to Ammianus tell of wives who rallied fleeing men and turned on cowards. Queens could command armies and rule in their own right. Female figures filled the pantheon as equals to the gods, and the spirits of war were as often female as male. The raven-shrieking presences of battle, the voices that haunted marsh and riverbank, the cunning figures of myth who loved and killed with equal resolve. All of these shaped a culture in which a woman on a war chariot was no anomaly. Ireland preserves this pattern with particular clarity. Even in the early medieval law codes, a nobleman was obliged to consult his wife on all matters. Marriage was a contract, not ownership. Women could sue and be sued, and they kept their marriage property upon separation, with additional compensation due. A daughter could inherit if there was no son, with the understanding that the household still owed military service, whether by a hired champion or by the woman herself, if she chose to fight. Christianity gradually narrowed these freedoms. In the first generations after Patrick, women still studied in monastic schools and rose to prominence as poets and scholars. Over time, clerical law and custom pressed the old balance out of shape. In Gaul and Britain, Rome had already begun the same work, and later the Church completed it. Boudica and Cartimandua, however, belonged to that earlier period when a woman's authority, legal, religious, and martial, was an established fact. Boudica ruled the Iceni in the region later called East Anglia. Her name, drawn from the Celtic word for victory, echoes the destiny she tried to claim. Her husband Prasutagus had accepted client status under Rome, and, seeking to placate the empire, willed half his estate to the Emperor Nero and half to his 2 daughters. Iceni lands were rich by then, heavy with grain, cattle, and treasure. On Prasutagus's death, Roman officers helped themselves. Houses were seized, storehouses emptied, animals slaughtered for feasts. Relatives who resisted were killed or enslaved. Merchants and minor officials joined the looting. Boudica objected and was seized. She was flogged before her people. Her daughters were raped. The crime was meant to humiliate as well as brutalize, a calculated assault on royal dignity and tribal pride. It had the opposite effect. The Iceni rose at once, and Boudica became the spear point of their rage. The Trinovantes, long provoked by the settlement of Roman veterans on their lands, and by a temple to the deified Claudius planted on a sacred site, joined her. The rebels struck first at Camulodunum. Omens multiplied. A statue of victory toppled as if fleeing. Strange cries echoed in the council house and theater. Red water washed ashore with shapes like corpses. The settlers, slow to dig ramparts and foolish enough to keep their families inside the town, were overwhelmed. A relief column from the 9th Legion was cut to pieces, its commander escaping with a remnant of cavalry. The temple garrison fell, and the city burned. Boudica moved on London. The town was not yet a chartered colony, but its position on the Thames made it strategic. Suetonius Paulinus marched hard from his campaign in North Wales and reached the city before the rebels. He weighed the odds, judged the place indefensible, and withdrew, despite the desperate pleas of the traders who begged him to stand. Boudica entered and put the town to the torch. Verulamium fell next. In victory, the British abandoned forts and garrisons to chase plunder. They took no captives and offered no ransoms. Throats were cut, fires lit, and scores settled. The Romans tallied dead in the tens of thousands across the 3 towns, though numbers in ancient accounts always swell with hindsight. Suetonius gathered what he could: veterans of the 14th, detachments of the 20th, auxiliaries, perhaps 10 to 20,000 men. He chose ground carefully, a narrow valley with woodland to his rear, where he could not be surrounded, and waited for the storm to break. Boudica rode the line in her chariot with her daughters beside her, and called on the tribes to fight for more than wealth or crowns, for freedom lost, for bodies scarred, for children defiled. The image endures, cast in bronze on the riverbank opposite Parliament. A mother and 2 girls braced above scything wheels, an eternal challenge hurled across the water. The clash was stark and direct, which favored the legions. Roman formations advanced in wedges. British ranks wavered and fell back, only to find their own wagons jammed behind them, crowding women, children, and animals into a fatal tangle. Discipline and steel did the rest. Ancient writers give wild casualty figures, 400 Romans against 80,000 Britons, but the shape of the day is clear enough. The Roman line held, pushed, and cut. The British broke and bled on their own baggage train. Boudica took poison rather than face capture. Her body vanishes from the record. In the settling dust, the governor called in fresh troops from Germany. The imperial procurator who had sent too little aid before the catastrophe was dismissed. Famine gnawed at the defeated tribes. Anger smoldered, and for a time, Nero even weighed the cost of holding Britain at all. A preening envoy from the emperor arrived and was laughed off by the still defiant provincials. Eventually, a new governor replaced Suetonius Paulinus, and open war subsided. Later, writers link Boudica to a war goddess named Andraste and describe grisly rites carried out in a sacred grove after the sack of London. Whether or not those lurid details are true, the association itself makes sense. In a world where battle had a face and a voice, and the crows of the battlefield spoke with a woman's cry, a queen could easily be imagined as the chosen of a goddess of war. Boudica's story, fierce and brief, lives at that intersection of law, custom, faith, and fury where Celtic queens once stood and the ancient world learned, briefly and unmistakably, what their power meant. Unlike Vercingetorix and Vortigern, Cartimandua and Boudica lived and fought at the same time, so weighing them against each other is far more straightforward. Familiar themes surface again: fidelity and treachery, radiant defiance of foreign power, and cool, transactional politicking. It's easy to slot Boudica into the role of uncompromising fighter and Cartimandua into that of shrewd fixer. But, as with their male counterparts, neat labels blur under scrutiny. Before anything else, the striking fact is this: both of these towering war leaders were women, which mattered enormously in the ancient world. Women stood unusually high in early Celtic life. Classical writers describe them brokering disputes and handing down judgments. Marriages were chosen rather than imposed, goods were jointly held, and an entire estate could pass to a surviving spouse. We see in the Iceni that a ruler could leave authority and lands to his daughters. Some ancient accounts even speak of shared marriages and descent reckoned through the mother. Roman authors relayed these with a scandalized air, but they may not have been wholly fanciful in parts of Gaul. Dedications from sanctuaries show women owning businesses in their own right. On campaign, women drove the baggage trains and, when needed, took the field. Sources from Polybius to Ammianus tell of wives who rallied fugitives and struck down cowards. Queens could rule and command. Goddesses filled the pantheon beside the gods, and the presence that hovered over battle was as often imagined with a woman's voice as a man's. In a culture like this, a queen standing in a chariot with spear and shield was not a marvel, but a natural sight. Ireland preserves this picture with particular force. Early law required a nobleman to consult his wife on all matters. Marriage was a contract, not ownership. Women could bring suit and keep their marriage property at parting, with additional damages due. If there was no son, a daughter could inherit, provided the household still met its military duty by champion, or, if she chose, by the woman herself. Christianity slowly thinned these freedoms. In the first generations after Patrick, women still studied at monastic schools and became renowned poets and scholars. Over time, church rules and custom compressed the old balance. In Gaul and Britain, Rome had already begun that shift, and later the church finished it. Yet Boudica and Cartimandua belong to an earlier moment, when a woman's legal, spiritual, and military authority was a settled fact. Boudica ruled the Iceni in the region later known as East Anglia. Her name, drawn from the Celtic root for victory, reads like a prophecy. Her husband, Prasutagus, had accepted client status under Rome and tried to keep the peace by willing half his estate to Nero and half to his 2 daughters. Iceni lands were rich by then with grain, cattle, and treasure. On his death, Roman officers helped themselves. Farms were seized, storehouses emptied, animals slaughtered. Kinsmen who resisted were killed or enslaved. Lesser Roman officials and traders joined the plunder. Boudica protested and was seized. She was flogged before her people. Her daughters were raped. It was meant to degrade as well as destroy. It had the opposite effect. The Iceni rose, and their queen became the blade of their anger. The Trinovantes joined them, chafing at a veteran colony planted on their lands and a temple to the deified Claudius forced onto a sacred site. The rebels struck first at Camulodunum. Omens multiplied. A victory statue toppled as if fleeing, strange cries echoed in the council house and theater, and blood-red water washed ashore with shapes like the dead. The settlers, slow to entrench and foolish enough to shelter families inside the town, were overrun. A relief column from the 9th was smashed, its commander escaping with a handful of horse. The temple garrison fell, and the city burned. Boudica turned to London. The town, though small, controlled the Thames. The governor, Suetonius Paulinus, raced from North Wales and arrived before the rebels. He weighed the odds, judged the place untenable, and pulled out despite merchants begging him to stay. Boudica entered and set it ablaze. Verulamium fell next. In triumph, the British abandoned strongpoints to chase loot, took no captives, and exacted vengeance without bargaining. The Romans counted the dead in tens of thousands across the 3 towns, though numbers in ancient texts grow with retelling. Suetonius gathered what he could: veterans of the 14th, parts of the 20th, auxiliaries, and sought ground that would blunt numbers, a narrow valley with woods behind to prevent encirclement. Boudica rode the line in her chariot with her daughters beside her, and called the tribes to fight for more than crowns or spoils, for freedom lost, for bodies scarred, for children wronged. The scene survives in bronze on the Thames embankment, a mother and 2 girls braced above the wheels, an image many Londoners pass daily without a thought. On open ground, the legions had the advantage. Roman wedges drove forward. The British fell back and piled into their own wagons, where families, animals, and baggage clogged the field. Discipline and iron did the rest. Ancient writers claim impossible casualty ratios, but the shape of the day is clear. The Roman line held and cut. The British broke on their own train. Rather than be led in chains, Boudica took poison. Her body passes out of the record, her figure into legend. In the aftermath, fresh troops came from across the Rhine. The imperial procurator who had failed to help was replaced. Hunger gnawed at the defeated, anger smoldered, and for a moment Nero even weighed abandoning Britain as more trouble than it was worth. A preening envoy was sent and laughed at. A new governor followed, and open revolt ebbed. Later, historians paired Boudica with a war goddess named Andraste and described savage rites in a sacred grove after London fell. Whether those lurid details are true or not, the association itself fits a world where battle had a goddess's face. Boudica, like Vercingetorix, drew loyalty from beyond her own people, which points to unusual force of character. She was likely unblemished in body, as Celtic kings and queens were expected to be, and Dio's portrait of a tall, formidable woman may not be far from the truth. Like the Arvernian leader, she seems to have imposed order by hard measures when it suited her. She must have had real skill in the crush and a fearless core. Coins from the Redans and Turones show bare-backed female riders and charioteers brandishing arms. Whether goddesses or queens, the warrior woman is unmistakable. Later ages tried to soften Boudica, dwelling on her injuries and noble grief. The plainer reading is probably closer to reality, an imposing, battle-tested aristocrat, fiercely proud of rank and right, capable of harsh reprisals, and relentless once resolved. Her campaign was brief and ended in defeat, yet she remains a standard of British defiance, invoked in verse and drama and woven into the persona of Britannia herself. Cartimandua, by contrast, slips through public memory, though her political reach was likely larger and her generalship more effective. Where Boudica became a symbol of resistance, Cartimandua has often been cast as a turncoat. Roman storytellers helped fix those roles. The Roman ideal of the dignified matron found a mirror, perversely, in the enemy queen fighting for her violated daughters, while Rome's ally became the cautionary tale of lust and betrayal whispered to girls at their mothers' elbows. Cartimandua ruled in her own right. Her husband, Venutius, was consort. She led the Brigantes, whose territory sprawled across much of northern Britain, the biggest tribal domain on the island. Rome had pushed its grip to the Lincoln area under Aulus Plautius, and his successor, Ostorius Scapula, was still grappling with the far north when Caraticus, son of Cunobelinus, stirred the Silures and Ordovices and looked to draw the Brigantes into a grand coalition. It was a bold vision, and it might have worked if all three had moved as one. Inside Brigantian walls, Cartimandua tired of Venutius and fell for his arms-bearer, Vellocatus. An open affair would have been an unforgivable insult. She needed Venutius out of the way. Her solution was drastic. She offered Brigantian territory as a Roman protectorate. The governor seized the chance. The divorce sparked civil war. Cartimandua took hostages from Venutius's kin. He answered by raising forces against her. The Romans, having a treaty with the queen, backed her with troops. Against this backdrop, Caraticus fought Ostorius and lost. He fled to Cartimandua's court, unaware of the new political weather. She handed him over in chains. It was a decisive, audacious move, and she must have known it would enrage the Silures and Ordovices. Rome paraded Caraticus in triumph. His dignity in defeat earned him clemency and a long captivity in the capital. Back in the north, the Silures proved impossible to cow, and governors came and went. Cartimandua held on through force of will and Roman help, but her people turned against her. The scandal of her marriage to Vellocatus, offensive to Roman taste, seems to have bruised Brigantian pride as well. Venutius rallied the druids, and through them, the clans. The argument took hold that the aging queen had lost the right to rule. Cartimandua fled with her lover to the safety of Roman lines at Camulodunum. There, under the wings of the legion, their world shrank to barrack squares and sour wine, the glamour gone, their names fading into footnotes. Venutius did not enjoy his revenge for long. A new governor marched north with fresh legions and broke him near modern Stanwick. We hear of other Brigantian forays led by women in the years that followed, and ancient authors note, with some astonishment, that British ranks sometimes seemed to hold more women than men. Even trimmed for rhetoric, the testimony is strong. Celtic women fought, and queens commanded. Against that backdrop, Boudica reads as the purer emblem, her cause crowned with raw justice, her end chosen rather than endured. Cartimandua's tale of passion, sharp turns, and the cold handover of a fellow king looks shabby by comparison, and her last years among the barracks feel like fitting punishment. Yet, judged inside their own circumstances, Cartimandua may have been the subtler force. She managed a kingdom far larger and more fractious than Boudica's, and kept her throne through years that would have broken lesser rulers. However unseemly her marriage looked, she followed it with hard-headed campaigning that repeatedly outmaneuvered Venutius. Handing over Caraticus was ruthless, but also clear-eyed statecraft, and she bore the consequences. As with Vercingetorix and Vortigern, we read these queens through accounts shaped by Roman tastes and moralizing. Strip those away, and two figures remain. Different in temperament, alike in authority, embodiments of a world where a woman's word could summon armies, and her will could bend the fate of nations.